What if your last meal was the last thing you ever tasted? Imagine the chill as you shuffle into a dimly lit chamber, the stench of despair lingering like an unwelcome guest. The executioner's shadow looms large, a harbinger of horrors that defy the imagination. Welcome to a world where punishment dances with creativity, and death becomes an art form, an exquisite nightmare where agony is the canvas. Medieval justice was not a gentle hand. It was a grotesque theater, a brutal ballet where the audience craved spectacle and the guilty paid with their lives. The gallows creaked with anticipation, but that was just the beginning. Ever heard of a breaking wheel? It wasn't your average torture device, it was a grim masterpiece, designed to stretch and shatter bones like brittle twigs. Picture it, the victim spinning slowly, each crack of the bone harmonizing with the gasps of the crowd, the macabre symphony of justice. And what of the infamous Iron Maiden? A sarcophagus from hell, adorned with spikes that promised a fitting farewell. It's not just a box, it's a riddle wrapped in cruelty. What were they thinking? I'll just pop in for a quick death? The twisted humor drips from the walls, medieval wit set to a soundtrack of moans and muffled screams. It was a time when laughter mingled with horror, and for every jest, a head rolled. But let's not forget the astonishing creativity behind the methods. The notorious drawing and quartering, a graphic nightmare that turned punishment into an art form. Imagine limbs splayed across the city, a twisted jigsaw puzzle for the morbidly curious. Was it brutality or was it performance art? Either way, folks packed their picnic baskets, eager to feast upon the spectacle of suffering. Who needs Netflix when you have live executions? Ever heard of the Judas cradle? An invention so ingenious it would make sadists weep with envy. A sharp, pyramid-shaped seat designed to impale the victim slowly, like a chef filleting a delicate fish. The crowd roared with laughter, while the victim, the poor soul, sat atop their fate, an unwilling participant in a grotesque game of survival. Even the puns write themselves, looks like he's taken a stab at it. As you linger in this dark carnival of death, the question gnaws at you, what compels society to invent such horrors? Is it the thirst for control or an insatiable curiosity about the abyss? Each method tells a story, each scream echoes through time, a chilling reminder that this bloody tapestry of history is woven with threads of fear, fascination, and a dash of dark humor. So, are you bold enough to confront the twisted mind of humanity? Can you stomach the truth behind these execution methods that not only condemn but entertain? Once you step into this world, there's no turning back. The shadows of the past await to reveal their cruel mysteries. Welcome to the stage of history where every death is a tale, and every tale leads you closer to the heart of darkness. The gallows loomed in the distance, a skeletal hand reaching toward the steel-gray sky, whispering promises of doom. The air crackled with tension, a suffocating blanket woven from the fear of the condemned and the excitement of the gathered crowd. My heart raced, thumping against my ribcage like a caged beast, desperate to escape. I stood there, trapped within the thrumming pulse of humanity, caught between the thrill of justice and the chill of cruelty. I remember the faces of those who gathered, their eyes glistening with a mix of morbid curiosity and grim satisfaction. The town crier, a man with a voice as harsh as gravel and a demeanor to match, bellowed the charges against the prisoner like a bard reciting a death knell. Thievery. Treason. Witchcraft. Each word landed with the weight of a stone, sinking into the hearts of those listening, stirring something primal. I felt it too, an insatiable hunger for justice, raw and unrefined, twisted with the ache of empathy for the wretched soul tied beneath the noose. And there he was, the prisoner, Thomas, a once respected craftsman brought low by desperation, his eyes a mosaic of defiance and despair. He was not merely a thief, he was a father, a husband, a man fallen from grace. I could see the tremor in his hands, the rebellious flicker in his gaze as he faced the crowd. His presence was electric, and I could feel the tension unfurling like a ribbon in the wind, weaving through the throng that had gathered to witness. In front of him stood Eleanor, a woman with a heart as fierce as her sorrow. She loved him fiercely, though love in this time was as fragile as spider silk, easily torn by the sharp claws of fate. She clutched the fabric of her dress, a futile attempt to shield herself from the world's cruelty, nails digging into her palms. Her eyes were wells of unspoken anguish, and I could almost hear the silent screams of her heart breaking, each crack echoing like thunder in the ominous sky. "Justice," they cried, the word rolling off their tongues like poison. Did they even know what it meant? Justice was not always the salve they sought. Sometimes it was the knife that cut deeper, the shadow that cloaked their own sins. I felt the weight of their judgment settle upon me, and I found myself asking, who here was truly innocent? The executioner emerged, a brooding figure draped in shadows, his face obscured beneath a hood that seemed to absorb the light around him. He was as much a part of this spectacle as the gallows themselves, a grotesque puppet master orchestrating the dance of death. I shivered, feeling the cold fingers of dread wrap around my throat. What had this man seen? What strange thoughts danced in his mind as he swung the axe, delivering justice with a detached efficiency? I imagined the weight of his own choices, the ghosts of the past clamoring for attention in the night. "Let him go!" Eleanor's voice cut through the clamor, a desperate cry that soared like a bird escaping a net. The crowd fell silent, a collective intake of breath, a moment of suspended disbelief. My heart raced with her, thumping painfully against hope. But hope, in this realm of harsh realities, was a brittle thing. It crumbled beneath the weight of the crowd's murmurs, a tide pulling back from the shore of mercy. "Would you cast aside justice for love?" the town crier called back, his voice dripping with scorn. "Would you risk the lives of others for the sake of one?" The crowd responded with a chorus of indignation, their anger a tempest, swirling around Eleanor like a storm. I could feel her spirit falter, a flicker of light extinguished beneath the oppressive shadow of their judgment. I remember the moment the gallows creaked, the sound like a heartbeat, echoing in the stillness that followed Eleanor's cry. The executioner stepped forward, the crowd's energy morphing into something palpable, almost alive, as if the very air turned electric with impending doom. Each heartbeat echoed in tandem with the swing of the pendulum, a terrible countdown to an irrevocable finale. And then there came the moment when time itself splintered, where justice and vengeance collided in a cacophony of sound and fury. I saw Thomas, his resolve crumbling, his voice breaking as he called out to Eleanor. "Forgive me," he pleaded, the words a caress and a curse all at once. I felt the weight of his despair press down upon my chest, squeezing until I could hardly breathe. Eleanor's face twisted in anguish, and I knew she was faced with the impossible choice, love or justice. The two were intertwined like the roots of a great oak, impossible to separate. Did she dare to defy the will of the crowd? Did she dare to plunge into the depths of her own heart, risking everything for a man who had stumbled into darkness? The executioner raised his hand, a signal, a command, and I felt the crowd surge forward, an instinctive wave of flesh demanding blood, demanding retribution. My legs felt like lead, cemented in place by the weight of their collective will. I was drowning in their fervor, the madness of the mob wrapping around me like chains. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, a quiet rebellion against this tide of bloodlust. And then, the world slowed. I saw Thomas's eyes, pools of regret reflecting the horror of his fate. I saw Eleanor, torn between love and justice, her heart a battlefield. Whispers of dreams unfulfilled haunted the air, memories of laughter and warmth drowned beneath the cold, hard reality of the gallows. "Justice," they shouted once more, but it echoed hollow, like a spectre of what justice should be. It was nothing more than the desperate cry of a people longing for some semblance of order in a chaotic world, a world where men hung for their sins and shadows danced in the twilight. As the executioner took his final steps toward the rope, I felt the ground shift beneath me, the very fabric of our existence unraveling in that moment. The air thickened with anticipation, heavy with the weight of all our sins. I was not just a witness, I was a part of this twisted narrative, cocooned in the fragile web of medieval justice, where love and law collided in a breathtaking, heart-wrenching climax. In that instant, the crowd held its breath, and the world stood still, teetering on the edge of chaos, where the line between justice and cruelty blurred, leaving only the chilling resonance of fate echoing through the night. A thick fog hung over the execution site, swirling like restless spirits, each curler whisper of the live snuffed out beneath the weight of a cruel sentence. The air was heavy, pregnant with fear and the faint scent of damp earth, as if the very ground mourned the lives it had claimed. I stood there, heart pounding, a spectator in the theater of death, surrounded by faces twisted in horror or masked in indifference. It was the perfect stage for an executioner's dance, a grim performance where the lead actor's role was steeped in shadows, guilt, and an unsettling kinship with the condemned. I remember the first time I saw Bastien, the executioner. He was a ghost of a man, a spectre clad in black, his eyes sunken but sharp, burning with a desperate hunger for absolution. The crowd trembled as he moved, each step echoing like a heartbeat, the solitary cadence of a man who had crossed the threshold into darkness and never returned. I remember the way he clutched the axe, it glinted in the dim light, a cruel promise of release wrapped in the weight of responsibility. To him, every swing was an act of mercy cloaked in the cloak of duty, but what mercy lurked in the hands of a man condemned to wield death? And then there was Elise, the watchmaker, her clock shop a sanctuary of ticking tranquility. She was the one who crafted the intricate mechanisms that marked the passage of time, yet her world was frozen in the moments of Bastien's executions. Each tick of her clocks held a secret, a sorrowful reminder of the lives that unraveled each time the axe fell. I remember her eyes, wide with fear yet glimmering with a fierce hope, as she whispered tales to the villagers, weaving legends of the executioner as if he were a tragic hero rather than a bringer of doom. But in her heart, she bore the heavy burden of knowing that every tale she spun could not silence the screams that echoed in her mind. The day of the execution loomed, a spectre that haunted the village like a cloud of dread. Bastien stood before a crowd that was a cacophony of anxiety, their breaths shallow and quick, fingers twitching in anticipation. His heart thudded in his chest, a relentless drumbeat of uncertainty. In that moment, as he prepared to fulfill his grim duty, all he could feel was the cold grip of despair. Am I the monster they imagine? He wondered, the question clawing at him like a wild beast. Each face in the crowd was a mirror reflecting his own doubts, a collective indictment. And so, the moment arrived. The clock in Elise's shop chimed, a cruel reminder that time was both a healer and a destroyer. In the distance, a figure was led forth, shackled and broken. The condemned man's eyes were hollow, yet they sought connection, a final plea for understanding that hung in the air like a noxious fog. Bastien's grip tightened around the handle of the axe, and in that moment, the weight of his duty bore down on him like the heavens collapsing. He was not merely an executioner, he was a reluctant keeper of fate, a guardian of the thin line between justice and vengeance. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and despair. The shadows elongated, and I could feel the atmosphere shift, thickening with dread. I remember the sound, the sickening thud of the axe meeting flesh, the gasp of the crowd, a collective intake of breath that shattered the silence like glass. Time paused, suspended in that agonizing heartbeat, and for a moment, I believed I could hear the universe holding its breath. But Bastien felt it, the shattering of his own soul, the splintering of his humanity. Each execution was a piece of him, severed and discarded like refuse. He remembered the faces of the dead, not as nameless scribbles in the annals of justice, but as lives with dreams and laughter, each one a reminder of his role in their end. He couldn't escape the memories, each one clawing its way to the surface, taunting him with the laughter of children, the warmth of love, the promise of tomorrows that would never come. Elise watched from the shadows, her heart aching as she witnessed the man she admired crumble beneath the weight of his choices. She wanted to scream, to rush forward and pull him from the abyss, but fear paralyzed her. Instead, she turned her gaze to the stars, painting her dreams in the dark canvas above, whispering wishes that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a path back from this darkness. In the aftermath, as the crowd dispersed, the tension shifted. Bastien remained, a solitary figure cloaked in the mantle of death, each heartbeat a reminder of the lives he had taken, each breath a burden he could not shed. The echoes of the condemned haunted him, was it justice or mere duty? Their questions reverberating through the empty air. And in that hollow silence, he found no solace. The clock in Elise's shop continued its relentless ticking, a cruel reminder that time waits for no one, not even for those burdened by the weight of their actions. She stood in her shop, surrounded by the soft chime of her creations, but the joy was hollow, a mask to cloak the heartache. Each tick sounded like a whisper of hope intertwined with despair, reminding her that while life continued, the ghosts of execution would always linger just beyond the shadows. So, in the gloom of the night, two souls, one wielding death, the other forging time, were intertwined by fate's cruel hand, each wrestling with their own demons yet bound by the shared weight of existence. Their stories, marked by loss and longing, unfurled into the twilight, a haunting testament to the lives they could never reclaim, a dance with shadows under a starless sky where every heartbeat echoed the timeless question, what price do we pay for justice? The moon hung ominously above the gallows, a silver glare piercing through the bleak darkness of the night. Shadows danced like twisted spirits among the gathered crowd, their whispers heavy with anticipation, swirling with dread. An unholy pact of fear and fascination gripped the townsfolk as they huddled together, their breath visible in the winter air, palpable and alive. I could hear the rasping of my own heartbeat as we stood there, eyes wide and souls trembling. I remember the sound of the executioner's boots, each thud echoing in the stillness, a herald of doom. His silhouette cut a terrifying figure, muscular and clad in an unremarkable black cloak that fluttered like a raven's wings in the night breeze. This was no ordinary man. He was a vessel of wrath, a grim reaper wielding tools of despair. I remember staring at his hands, calloused from labor, gripping the heavy axe, its blade gleaming under the moonlight like a predator's eye. Beside me stood Eliza, her face pale, eyes shimmering with unshed tears that spoke of her own torment. She was a seamstress, a dreamer with hands that wove fabric into stories, but now stood witness to the end of a life. "Why do they do this?" she whispered, voice trembling with anguish. "Why must they take joy in such cruelty?" I wanted to answer her, to wrap her in the soft embrace of reassurance, but the truth lay twisted beneath the surface. Execution was a spectacle, a show of power. It was a grim theater where the audience came to witness humanity at its most grotesque. "They believe it brings order," I said, my own voice thick with a sorrow I couldn't shake off. "A man's death for the sins of all." There was John, the town's blacksmith, standing close by, a broad-shouldered man with a heart as heavy as the iron he shaped. He had once forged swords to defend against invaders, weapons glittering with the promise of heroism. Now, he watched, eyes hollow, as the axe swung down, the finality resonating like a death knell in his chest. "It's a farce," he muttered, clenching his fists. "We're just as guilty as he is." And there it was, the conflicted heart of a man caught between duty and morality, the man who had once believed in the righteousness of his craft. He had pounded metal into something beautiful, something strong. What had he wrought now? I could see it in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, a glimpse of the truth, that he was no longer the hero, but a spectator in a world that spun out of control. The executioner raised his axe, and the world held its collective breath, time collapsing into the sharpness of that instant. The crowd gasped, a single sound that pierced the air, a human symphony of dread. I felt Eliza flinch beside me, her fingers curling into my arm, nails digging in as if to anchor herself against the tide of horror. The blade swung down, slicing through the silence, the thud against flesh resonating in my bones. The man's cry echoed, a desperate sound that reverberated in the night, a plea for mercy, a gasp of betrayal. My stomach knotted, a visceral response to the violence I could barely comprehend. Execution, in all its grotesque glory, was a dance of life and death, an art form bathed in the blood of the unsaved. I remembered the stories the elders would tell by the flickering firelight, the tales of betrayal, of sins that haunted the living long after the dead had been laid to rest. "It's justice," they would say, but what justice was there in this horror? I felt the question loom, vast and unanswerable in the darkness. I turned to Eliza, searching for some glimmer of hope in the depths of despair. But what hope could exist in the shadow of the gallows? "It's a reminder," I said softly, searching for the words. "A reminder that we must not stray too far from the path." Her eyes pierced through me, furious and wounded. A reminder? Or a lesson in cruelty? And there it was, the raw truth laid bare. Execution was not merely a punishment, it was a spectacle, a circus of mortality that paraded despair for all to see. I clenched my jaw, the heaviness of reality settling in my chest. Each swing of the axe was a beat in the rhythm of this macabre dance. The crowd began to disperse, their faces a tapestry of emotions, fear, relief, disgust. I felt John's gaze on me, a silent acknowledgement of the shared burden we bore. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice low, a rumble of uncertainty. The night stretched endlessly ahead, a void filled with unspoken questions and broken dreams. Eliza stepped closer, her voice fierce. We remember them. We honor their stories. We don't let this moment be just another part of the cycle. And in that fleeting moment, she transformed from a frightened girl into a beacon of defiance, a spark in the dark. I could feel the warmth of her conviction as it mingled with the chill of the night, and I wanted to believe. I wanted to seize that hope, to grasp it tightly against the night's horrors. But the executioner lingered at the edge of my vision, a dark silhouette against the dimming moonlight, waiting for his next victim. The air crackled with the weight of unfinished stories, of lives halted in their tracks, and I shuddered at the thought of what lay ahead. In that moment, I realized the shadows were not merely specters of the past but harbingers of the future, whispering of cycles unbroken, of fates entwined in the fabric of our existence. With every heartbeat, the town remained, a witness to its own brutality, its own tragedy. And with every breath, I felt the yearning for change, a desperate need for the cycle to shatter and for something new to rise from the blood-soaked earth. As the last echoes of the axe faded into the night, I knew this was not an end, but merely a beginning. The stories of the fallen would haunt us, forever intertwining our fates in a dance of despair and hope, a continuum where the line between justice and cruelty blurred into a haunting memory, undying and relentless. The rope hangs, a silent serpent poised to strike. It sways slightly in the breeze, teasing the charged air with promises of both dread and relief. The gallows loom, a stark silhouette against a bruised sky, its wooden beam soaked in the weight of 1,000 regrets. Here, time bends. Seconds stretch impossibly long, like the gnarled hands of a clock that refuses to tick in moments of agony. I can almost taste the bitterness of fear, a metallic tang that dances on the tongue, taunting me as I stand on the precipice of this moment, caught between the thrill of life and the looming shadow of death. Nora, her fingers trembling, clutches the frayed edge of her shawl. Each breath she takes is a whisper, a prayer woven into the fabric of the night. She's here, yet she isn't, lost in the fog of her own thoughts, her mind spiraling into the abyss of what ifs. Her brother, Samuel, condemned for a crime he didn't commit, stands beneath the gallows, a ghost of the boy she once knew. His eyes, once bright with mischief, now reflect the hopelessness of 1,000 shattered dreams. I remember, she murmurs to herself, the day he taught me how to climb trees. We reached for the sky, laughing like fools, unaware of the chains that would bind him here. The crowd gathers, a sea of faces twisted in morbid curiosity. Some tremble with anticipation, others with fear. Each one harbors a secret, a story, a reason that pulls them into this macabre theater. They are witnesses to a ritual where justice wears a mask of cruelty, where the scales are hopelessly tipped. I can feel the tension crackle in the air, a live wire ready to snap. Just like Nora, I wonder, how can we claim to be civilized when we stand by and watch the execution of a man whose only crime was to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? As the executioner steps forward, the crowd falls silent, a collective breath held tight in throats that constrict with dread. He is a spectre of death, draped in shadows, moving with a chilling grace that belies the horror of his task. I catch a glimpse of his eyes, cold, detached, as if he is merely performing a duty, devoid of any human emotion. This is justice, he seems to whisper to himself, as if trying to convince both the crowd and his own conscience. And then there's Samuel. Oh, how he stands there, shoulders squared, a man forged by defiance and despair. I want to scream, to shake him awake from this nightmare, to tell him that there's still time to run, to escape, to live. I remember when he told me about the stars, how they were once a map to guide him home. But now, the only map he has leads to this final destination, a noose, a drop, a heartbeat that will flutter and die. Nora, he calls, voice steady, pulling her back from the precipice of her own dark musings. Don't cry for me. I am not afraid. But those words are both a balm and a blade, cutting through the thick fog of despair, leaving her reeling. How can he not fear? How can he face the abyss with such calm? As if the weight of the world rests lightly upon his shoulders, while hers threatens to crush her beneath its enormity. I remember, she whispers, her heart breaking in tandem with each shuddering breath. I remember the laughter. I remember our dreams. Samuel's gaze doesn't waver. Then hold on to that. Hold on for us both. He smiles, but it's a ghost of a smile, a flicker of light in the encroaching darkness. In that moment, the world around them fades, the crowd, the gallows, the grim spectre of death. It's just the two of them, suspended in a fragile bubble of shared memories, of innocence lost to the cruel hands of fate. The executioner approaches, rope in hand, and the air thickens, heavy with finality. Nora's heart races, thumping like a war drum, desperate to drown out the rising tide of despair. No, she cries, but the sound is swallowed by the night, lost among the shadows that creep ever closer. She can't bear the thought of losing him, of the rope stealing his breath, the drop severing their connection forever. But reality is relentless, a cruel mistress that does not bend for love. The rope is looped, the noose tightened, it's a dark embrace, a final farewell that her heart cannot fathom. Samuel stands still, resolute as a statue, and for a brief moment, I glimpse the boy he once was. The boy who believed in the stars, who wove dreams from laughter, who climbed trees towards the sky. And as the lever is pulled, the world holds its breath. A gasp ripples through the crowd, a symphony of horror mingled with reluctant fascination. It is not just a man swinging beneath the gallows, it is hope extinguished, a dream snuffed out. Nora's scream pierces the night, raw and visceral, echoing the agony of all those who have ever watched helplessly as the threads of fate tangled beyond repair. In this moment of horror, time fractures, and I can see the threads of lives interwoven, each heartbeat a testament to the fragility of existence. I remember the laughter, the innocence, the warmth of the sun on our faces as we chased dreams. And now, as Samuel's body sways like a pendulum of despair, I realize, this is not merely about one man's fate, it's a reflection of us all, a haunting reminder of the darkness that lurks within the soul of humanity. Nora collapses, her heart shattered, cradling memories that now feel like shards of glass, each one cutting deeper than the last. She is left standing on the edge of a void, staring into the abyss, where the past mingles with the present in a tragic dance. And the rope, that terrible, beautiful rope, continues to sway, a reminder that life, with all its brutal truths, never truly lets go. Somewhere in the night, the stars flicker uncertainly, as if they, too, are mourning. The crackling of wood, a sinister symphony under a shrouded sky, mingled with the sharp, acrid scent of smoke curling upward into the twilight. Flames danced hungrily, flickering shadows on the faces of those gathered. They stood, wide-eyed and breathless, their breaths visible in the cold air, hearts pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration, each pulse a reminder that they were witnesses to something sacred and profane. The air thrummed with an energy both electric and suffocating, as if the very fabric of the universe held its breath, waiting. I remember Eliza. I remember the way her laughter rang out like a bell, bright and clear, cutting through the murky fog of despair that hung over our village. Now, though, her laughter was swallowed by the winds of accusation, lost amongst the cries of the crowd. She stood at the stake, bound but unbroken, a figure of defiance cloaked in fear. The flames licked the air around her, a chorus of crackling promises whispering about purification and piety. Her eyes, those fierce pools of emerald, pierced through the dark, searching the crowd, seeking the familiar, her mother, once a pillar of strength, now reduced to a quivering shadow. "Mother!" Eliza's voice rang out, sharp as a blade, cutting through the thick tension. But there was no answer, only the collective gasp of the spectators, their breaths mingling with the smoke that spiraled into the heavens, carrying with it their collective hopes and fears. I felt the tremor in my own heart, the way it echoed against my ribs like a caged bird, desperate to escape the impending doom. I stood among them, torn between the desire to scream for justice and the paralyzing fear of being next. The inquisitors, grim and relentless, roamed through the crowd, eyes gleaming with a twisted form of righteousness. They thrived on the chaos, feeding it like a ravenous wolf. And there was Marcus, my brother, his face a mask of anguish. I could see it in his eyes, the struggle between loyalty and belief, the weight of the blood that bound us to this moment. "Do you think they'll really do it?" he whispered, his voice trembling as he clutched my arm, knuckles white against my sleeve. I wanted to tell him it was just a show, that they would see reason, that love would conquer hate, but the words lodged in my throat like a stone. I could only shake my head, the truth, bitter and sharp, swirling around us. Eliza was condemned, but she was also a martyr, a lighthouse in a storm of ignorance. I saw her lips move, forming words that were lost in the cacophony of the crowd. I couldn't hear them, but I could see the defiance in her stance, the way she held her head high, even as the flames hissed and crackled around her like serpents poised to strike. I remember thinking how she was a heroine in her own tragedy, a beacon of hope for the lost souls gathered in the dark. The memories flooded me, unbidden, her laughter as we played by the river, the way she would race back to our homes, barefoot and wild, arms outstretched towards the clouds, as if she could touch the very fabric of the cosmos. But now, that wildness was ensnared, bound by the chains of accusation, and each flicker of flame threatened to consume not just her body, but the very essence of who she was. "Burn the witch," a voice cried out, and the crowd surged forward, a wave of fury and zeal. I felt the heat from the flames, not just on my skin but in my soul, a burning anger mixing with despair. What had she done but love too fiercely, think too freely? The weight of the world pressed down on my chest, a heavy stone that threatened to crush me. And then there was Marcus, eyes darting like a trapped animal. "We have to do something," he urged, but the fire was already roaring, its hunger insatiable. I could see the shadows of doubt creeping into his heart, the fear that if we stepped forward, the flames might turn on us too. The battle inside him raged like a tempest, and I could feel it tugging at my own heart. We had been raised to believe in loyalty, in family, but what good was blood when it was washed away by the flames of ignorance? "Stay close," I whispered, fear mingling with adrenaline. I felt time stretch and bend, as if the very universe conspired to trap us in this moment. The flames flickered, illuminating the faces of those who had come to witness the spectacle, hungry for catharsis, eager for the purification that would come with the sacrifice of one so innocent. I wanted to scream, to shake them awake, to make them see the absurdity of this twisted theater of cruelty. Yet, even in this chaos, I felt a spark of hope. I remembered Eliza's words, her dreams of a world where love triumphed over fear, where faith was not a weapon but a refuge. The flames flickered and roared, yet I imagined them transforming, not into a force of destruction, but into the very light she had envisioned, a light that could burn away the darkness that shrouded our hearts. "Let them burn," came another voice, shrill with zeal. A shudder coursed through the crowd, as if a ghost had passed between us. I could feel the pulse of that fever, the madness that swept through the onlookers like a contagion. What had become of us? What had we allowed to fester? Eliza's eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, everything shifted. The world around us faded, the crowd became a blur, and it was just her, a flame of defiance in a world soaked in shadows. She was not just a victim, she was a symbol, a spark that could ignite a revolution. "Remember me," she mouthed, her voice lost in the tumult, but I felt it echo deep within me, a haunting refrain that would linger long after the last embers died. It ignited something inside me, something fierce and unyielding. My heart raced. I could no longer stand still, could no longer be a bystander. The fire crackled, and as I stepped forward, the crowd shifted, a wave of humanity, a living, breathing entity. The flames danced higher, ominous and beautiful, but I felt only the heat of Eliza's spirit against my skin, urging me on. And in that intense, spine-chilling moment, I understood. The flames would purify, but not in the way they imagined. They would burn away the veil of fear that shrouded us, ignite a fire of rebellion in our hearts, and as I moved into the chaos, I knew we were not just witnesses. We were the beginning of something that could not be extinguished, a fire that would spread beyond this night, beyond this moment, into the very soul of the world. The chill of dawn hung in the air, its fingers grasping at the mist-shrouded gallows, where shadows danced like lost souls waiting for judgment. I stood there, heart racing, pulse hammering against my ribcage like a drum announcing the arrival of doom. My breath fogged in the frigid air, mixing with the faint scent of iron and wood, just like the stories whispered around tavern tables, where laughter and horror collided. A figure emerged from the darkness, dragging chains, each clink echoing a heartbeat of despair. A man, once a nobleman, now a broken creature, stripped of dignity, his eyes dull, haunted. I felt a pang of empathy, tangled with a surge of revulsion. This was the moment that marked the end of one life, and perhaps, the beginning of another cycle of violence. "Traitor," the crowd roared, a monstrous entity, swelling with bloodlust. Their faces were a canvas of rage and delight, a bizarre blend that made my stomach churn. I could feel their anticipation, the visceral hunger for a spectacle that transcended life and death. I found myself trapped between fascination and horror, a voyeur to history unfolding in its most grotesque form. As the executioner stepped forward, a grim figure clad in black, his presence seemed to darken the very air around us. The glint of his blade caught the early light, slicing through the fog like a promise of pain. I could hear the whispers of the crowd, their voices a low murmur of excitement, mingling with the rustling of burlap cloaks and the shuffling of feet on muddy ground. Each whispered word a prayer for the sinner's demise, each breath a countdown to the inevitable. But my eyes were drawn to the man at the gallows. He was a once great lord, now stripped of all but the rags that clung to his frame. I saw the flicker of defiance in his gaze, igniting a fire that burned against the cold comfort of despair. He was a warrior still, even as the noose slipped over his head, tightening with the promise of finality. I felt a surge of sympathy clash with the bitter reality. His ambition had led him here, to this macabre stage of reckoning. "Do you remember the whispers?" he cried out, his voice cutting through the din, raw and unyielding. "Do you remember the promises of power and glory?" His words hung in the air heavy with irony, as if the very cosmos had conspired to bring this ruin upon him. I remembered how the air would thrum with ambition, how dreams could turn treacherous, and how the thirst for power could lead even the noblest hearts astray. The crowd's jeers vanished momentarily, replaced by an eerie silence, a collective breath held in anticipation. I felt the weight of it, the tension coiling tighter, like a serpent ready to strike. In that moment, the executioner raised his hand, the signal to end this charade. A rush of adrenaline coursed through me. I wanted to scream, a warning, an invocation. But nothing escaped my lips. I was caught in an unending loop of horror. And then it happened. The trapdoor opened beneath him, and for an instant, he soared, suspended in a brutal ballet, a fleeting reminder of what it meant to be alive. But gravity is a merciless master. He fell, the rope snapping taut, and I felt the collective gasp of the crowd permeate my very being. His body jerked, a marionette severed from its strings, and I could taste the bitterness of despair on my tongue. Yet even then, in that grotesque stillness, something shifted. The crowd erupted, howls of approval mingling with gasps of shock as the executioner readied his tools. I could feel the pulsating momentum of the moment, a visceral high that threatened to consume us all. The man's life, reduced to a spectacle, a grotesque dance of agony and blood, while I stood paralyzed, caught in a whirlwind of emotions. "Let it be known," the executioner shouted, lifting his blade high, the sun glinting off its edge like a star fallen from grace. "This is the fate of traitors." I could almost hear the echoes of his words reverberate through the ages, the weight of them bearing down on me, pressing like a vice around my heart. As the blade fell, severing flesh from bone, I felt the world shatter. Each drop of blood that splattered upon the earth was a sacrifice, a payment for the sins of ambition, betrayal, and hubris. I could hear the wet thud echo in the silence, an exclamation point to a life extinguished. And yet, there was a strange beauty in the brutality, a grim poetry in the chaos. But it was the face of the traitor that haunted me. His eyes, even in death, told a story that no one would ever hear. A story of love lost, of dreams shattered, of a heart that had dared to reach for the stars and crashed back to the earth. He was not just a traitor, he was a man, a flawed being made of flesh and blood, caught in the intricate web of fate and consequence. As the crowd cheered, their voices merging into a cacophony of jubilation and revenge, I stood frozen, a witness to the tragedy unfolding beneath me. The executioner continued his grim task, methodically dismembering, as if artistry could somehow reclaim the soul of the deceased. And I realized then, the horror lay not just in the act but in the normalization of it, the acceptance of violence as a form of entertainment, a collective delusion veiled in righteousness. With each slice of the blade, I felt myself unraveling like the threads of a tapestry woven with dreams and nightmares. The echoes of laughter faded into the distance, replaced by haunting memories of what it meant to be human in a world that demanded sacrifice at the altar of power. I walked away, the sounds of the crowd fading behind me, but the weight of the moment clung to me like a heavy fog. That day, the gallows stood not just as a place of execution but as a monument to ambition's folly, a place where dreams came to die and where the true nature of humanity was laid bare, raw and unfiltered. The blade glimmers under the grey sky, a twisted sun, smothered by clouds, as if the heavens themselves hesitate to witness the spectacle below. A hush falls over the crowd, a cacophony of heartbeats syncing with the rhythmic thud of a war drum echoing like a death knell. I stand there, breath caught between my throat and the promise of horror that dances in the air, where dread mingles with an unquenchable thirst for spectacle. Eleanor, my sister, clutches my arm, her fingers digging in like claws, as if she fears she might be swept away in the tide of this moment. Her wide eyes reflect the terror that grips her heart, a fear not just for the condemned, but for the weight of history that presses down upon us, an execution, noble in its brutality, a ritual soaked in the blood of the innocent and the guilty alike. Across the wooden platform, the condemned man, a knight stripped of honor, stands tall, a defiant lion in the face of inevitable doom. His name is Sir Alistair, a man whose charm could conquer kingdoms, now reduced to a mere footnote in the annals of time. I can see the tremor in his hands, the flicker of regret in his eyes. What haunted dreams clung to him as he lay in darkened chambers, tormented by the weight of his choices? In that silence, I hear echoes of his past, whispers of lost victories and shattered hopes. Before the executioner, a figure cloaked in shadows, takes his first step forward. I remember the stories whispered by the fire, tales of kings and queens, of honor and glory, and the price one pays for power. But those stories never spoke of the grim satisfaction found in the chime of steel against flesh, or the way blood can paint a canvas of history red and vibrant as the roses that bloom in the spring. A gasp ripples through the crowd, and I turn to Eleanor. "Isn't it sickeningly beautiful?" I murmur, irony dripping from my lips, but she can't hear me over the crescendo of dread swelling in the air. The executioner raises the sword, its wicked edge sharp and gleaming, a promise of finality wrapped in the shroud of dignity. The knight's eyes flicker toward the sky, perhaps searching for a final blessing from the gods who've long abandoned him. Time stretches, an elastic band pulled taut, and I'm entranced. The world around me fades, the scent of damp earth blending with the metallic tang of fear that hangs heavy. I think of my own misgivings, the heavy cloak of doubt that drapes over my shoulders. What would I do in his place? Would I meet my end with such grace, or would I falter, a pathetic wretch begging at the feet of fate? The crowd holds its collective breath, 1,000 souls suspended in that fleeting moment, and suddenly, a flash, no, a memory of laughter envelops me. I see Eleanor and me, carefree, dancing in the fields under a sun that seemed eternal. But all that is gone now, swallowed by the shadows of authority and the spectre of doom looming over Sir Alistair's head. "Forgive me," he whispers, his voice breaking like glass, the sound shattering the silence, and with it, my heart. What haunts him? A life's worth of choices, faces of fallen comrades, the ghost of love unfulfilled? And I realize then, with a gut-wrenching clarity, that every person here carries their burdens, their own demons clinging like shadows, but none as stark as his. The blade comes down, swift as a whisper, and the world erupts into chaos. The crowd roars, an unholy symphony of triumph and despair. I feel Eleanor stiffen beside me, her breath escaping in a gasp, and the air turns electric, crackling with raw emotion. I close my eyes, but the image is branded behind my lids, Sir Alistair's face, a mask of sorrow, then nothing. Just the echo of a life extinguished, a candle snuffed out in the wind. Why do they do it? Eleanor's voice trembles, breaking through my haze, her eyes glistening, brimming with unshed tears. Is this justice? Or merely cruelty dressed in the guise of honor? Perhaps, I reply, the weight of uncertainty pressing against my chest, the line between justice and cruelty is as thin as the blade that fell him. Around us, the crowd disperses, their faces painted with a mix of horror and exhilaration as they recount the event, each retelling a stitch in the fabric of history. I wonder, will they remember Sir Alistair for his valour, or merely for the spectacle of his death? Will his heart's desires fade into nothingness, drowned in the blood-soaked sands of time? Eleanor's hand slips from my grasp, her gaze locked on the platform, her expression a tempest of confusion and anger. "This is wrong," she whispers, her voice a fragile thread of defiance. "This should not be how we honor a life." Can honor even survive in a world that celebrates death? I reply, my own voice trembling. Or is it all just a game, a macabre dance of power, where the players are stripped naked, exposed before an audience that revels in their demise? The night begins to unfurl like a dark cloak, shadows swallowing the remnants of the day. I glance at the people around me, their faces are etched with a morbid fascination, as if they found solace in watching the end unfold. It gnaws at my insides, this collective hunger for the grotesque. A fleeting glance at Eleanor reveals her turmoil, a storm brewing beneath her surface, and the urge to scream for justice mingles with the fear that grips her heart. We are left standing at the precipice of sorrow, caught in a world where life and death dance a delicate waltz, where beheading is a noble execution, a cultural rite steeped in the blood of countless souls. As the shadows deepen, time ticks away, relentless and unforgiving, blurring the lines between past and future, between love, loss, and the haunting question of what it means to truly live. I remember the stories, the shadows, the blood-stained past, and the relentless march of time. And as the echoes of the crowd fade, I know this is just the beginning, a haunting cycle of life and death, forever intertwined, spiraling into the abyss, always reaching, never quite grasping. The air was thick with the scent of iron and sweat, a miasma of fear that clung to the skin like a shroud. A crowd had gathered, their faces a cacophony of dread and morbid curiosity, hearts beating as one in a rhythm of despair. They stood in the shadow of the gallows, the sun a cruel spectator, glaring down upon the wooden beams that loomed like the specters of death itself. I remember the gasp, a collective intake of breath, as the condemned man was dragged forth, shackles clinking, a symphony of sorrow echoing through the square. Julian, a guard with a heart that fluttered painfully in his chest, felt the pull of duty clash violently against the tug of compassion. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of his choices. Today, he would witness not merely a death, but a spectacle, a crucifixion, a brutal reminder of the power wielded by those in authority. Each nail struck into flesh would resonate in his soul, each scream would reverberate in his mind. He closed his eyes for just a heartbeat, wishing to escape, to unsee what was unfolding before him, but the screams clawed their way into his consciousness with an insistent ferocity. Beside him, Clara, a healer-turned-reluctant witness, could hardly breathe, her chest tight with the knowledge of what was to come. She had tended to the wounds of the city, bandaged the broken and cared for the condemned, only to stand here, powerless, as justice twisted itself into a grotesque form. "This is not justice," she whispered, her voice a mere tremor against the din of the crowd. But who would hear her? The masses were hungry for blood, craving a release from their own despair, and she was but a ghost among them. Julian's eyes slid to Clara, her face pale as moonlight against the encroaching darkness of the event. He remembered her laughter, once a bright melody in the dullness of the castle walls. Now, her eyes were pools of sorrow, reflecting the agony that would soon unfold. A sharp pang of guilt sliced through him as he thought of the last time they had spoken, her pleas for mercy swallowed by the cold stone walls of duty. It was the moment of truth, the moment that would etch itself into the annals of his memory. The hammer raised, glinting in the sun, a gleaming harbinger of pain. The sound of metal meeting would rang out like the tolling of a death knell, jarring in its finality. I remember the gasp that escaped my lips, a mixture of horror and fascination, as the first nail pierced the flesh, the visceral scream that erupted from the man's throat, raw and primal. Pain, real and unrelenting, surged through the crowd, each person feeling the weight of it, a shared heartbeat of terror. Clara's hands instinctively reached out, as if she could bridge the distance between herself and the man on the cross, a wishful thought that perhaps she could somehow ease his suffering. "This isn't right," she pleaded, her voice drowning in the roar of the crowd, her heart breaking for a stranger whose fate was sealed by the indifference of men. But who would listen? The very heavens seemed to conspire in this act of cruelty, as the clouds thickened above, darkening the day as if mourning the loss of humanity. Julian's heart pounded in time with the hammer, each strike a reminder of his role in this macabre dance. He felt the blood rush to his ears, drowning out the cries of the condemned, drowning out Clara's frantic whispers. A sense of powerlessness enveloped him, and he wanted to scream, to tear through the crowd and end this madness. But the weight of his armor felt heavy, binding him to the ground, shackling his spirit. With each nail driven deeper, the man's body writhed, his face contorting in agony. I felt the air grow cold, the weight of despair pressing down, smothering. A woman in the crowd wailed, the sound gut-wrenching enough to chill the bones. Clara's eyes searched for something, hope? Mercy, but found only the unyielding gaze of the crowd, hungry for violence, thirsting for punishment. Why do they do this? She cried, the anguish spilling over like a broken dam. What do they hope to gain? Her voice was a fragile thing, cracking under the weight of grief. Julian could feel her desperation, a palpable force that tugged at him, urging him to push against the tide of indifference that surged around them. And then, in that moment, the world shifted. The man on the cross, his body trembling, lifted his gaze. It was a gaze that transcended the pain, a gaze that pierced through the layers of cruelty, reaching for something beyond the carnage. I remember feeling the world pause, a fleeting heartbeat of silence amidst the chaos. The crowd, poised on the edge of frenzy, held its breath, lost in the depth of that gaze. "Forgive them," he rasped, a confession laden with the weight of humanity. His voice, though faint, wrapped around me like a cloak of sorrow, filling the air with a haunting resonance. In that moment, even Julian felt the crack in his armor, a sliver of humanity breaking through the hardened facade. The nails, the blood, the suffering, it all became something more, a reflection of their own lives, their own struggles. As the final nail was driven and the cross was raised, a collective shudder coursed through the crowd. The shadows lengthened, twisting and turning like the very souls of the onlookers, caught in this grisly tableau of despair. Clara's hand reached for Julian, fingers brushing against the cool metal of his armor, seeking solace in a moment where nothing could be done. But the weight of their helplessness hung in the air like a funeral shroud. Time felt like a cruel joke, each second stretching into eternity as the reality of the moment settled in. The air thickened with an unshakable tension, a haunting echo of sorrow that would linger long after the crowd dispersed. What were they witnessing? A punishment? A sacrifice? Or a reminder that in their quest for power, they had lost sight of their own humanity? The sun dipped lower, casting a blood-red glow over the scene, a cruel irony that seemed to mock the very essence of suffering. As the shadows of night began to creep in, I felt the weight of history settle on my shoulders, an unyielding reminder of the cycles of pain and the choices that brought us here. The cries of the condemned man dissolved into the ether, but his gaze remained, a flicker of defiance in a world awash with despair. Julian stood frozen in that moment, caught between the ghosts of his past and the chains of his present. Clara's hand tightened around his, grounding him in a reality that felt unbearably fragile. They were witnesses to the depth of human capacity for both cruelty and compassion, bound together by a moment that transcended time itself. And as the last flickers of light faded, the world held its breath, waiting, as though what would come next might echo through the ages, stitching together the fabric of a dark and twisted legacy. In that suffocating silence, one truth emerged: the story of the crucifixion was not merely a tale of death, it was a haunting reminder of the human heart, capable of both torment and redemption. The weight of it all settled heavily on Julian, Clara, and all those who dared to witness the crucifixion, etching their souls into the annals of time, forever changed. The air hangs heavy, suffocating, a dense fog that clings to the skin like a shroud. The distant echo of a mournful bell tolls, each chime slicing through the silence like a knife. It's a sound that promises suffering, not salvation. The village square is empty, save for a figure, bound, blooded, and broken, sprawled beneath the ancient wheel, its spokes stained with the history of despair. I can smell the iron tang of blood, thick and metallic, rising off the ground like a ghost. A woman stands to the side, her heart pounding, each beat a reminder of how it feels to be alive while another suffers. Ilara, once vibrant, now hollowed by grief, watches the scene unfold through a haze of tears. Each sob hits her chest like a stone, heavy and relentless. She had always been the one to protect. But now? Now she is powerless, tethered to her own helplessness. She remembers the laughter, the warmth of her brother's embrace, the way he would twirl her around in the fading light of day. "Hold on, Ilara," he said. "We'll find a way." But he's not here, and now the wheel stands as a testament to her failure, a monstrous apparatus of fate designed to break the damned. Next to her, a man named Eric stands rigid. His jaw clenches, muscles coiling tight as he fights the urge to rush forward. He's a soldier, they say, yet now he feels like an imposter. His sword, once a symbol of honor, now seems a coward's tool, weighing heavy at his side. You can't save him, he mutters beneath his breath, as if to convince himself. But he remembers the first time he laid eyes on Elara, how her laughter cast shadows away. She filled every room with light, and he thought he could be brave. But bravery feels like a distant memory now, swallowed by the darkness around the wheel. The wheel creaks, a low groan that resonates through the air, and with it comes a rush of sound, the crowd, a murmur of voices, a sea of faces twisted in anticipation. They are here to witness the unthinkable, to drink in the suffering of another soul as if it were the sweetest nectar. They are the damned too, in their own ways, lost in their lives, hoping to find meaning in the cruelty of others. The condemned man, once proud, now writhes in agony, straps digging into his skin, taunting him. "I'm not afraid," he shouts, but the tremor in his voice betrays him. His eyes dart to Elara, pleading for salvation she cannot offer. "Elara! Help me!" The word help hangs in the air, sharp and jagged. She feels it cut through her heart. "I remember," she murmurs, a mantra echoing in her mind. "I remember the nights we spent under the stars, dreaming of escaping this wretched place." The memories cascade like a torrent, overwhelming her, filling her with both longing and dread. Eric's hand tightens around the hilt of his sword. "We can't just stand here," he says, voice trembling as he steps toward the wheel. "We have to do something." But he knows deep down that this is not a battle he can fight with steel. He looks at Elara, searching her face for strength, for a spark of the fire that once burned so brightly within her. But her eyes are dimmed, clouded by desperation. "You want to save him," she whispers, venom lacing her tone. "What will you do? Slice the ropes with your pretty sword? You think that'll change anything? This wheel will turn, it always does." He falters at her words, the truth hitting him like a blow. The wheel is the embodiment of fate, turning slowly, grinding down hope and joy into dust. "We can't let him die like this," he gasps, but the words feel hollow, devoid of any real meaning. It's the fear of facing their own powerlessness that paralyzes them both. The man beneath the wheel lets out a scream, raw and unfiltered, a sound that reverberates through the marrow of their bones. It echoes against the stone walls of the village, a haunting melody that dances with the shadows. Elara's heart splinters at the sound, and she feels the weight of despair settle on her shoulders like a cloak. She wants to look away, to shield herself from the horror, but she can't. She won't. And then, in a moment that stretches into infinity, she locks eyes with the condemned man. "I'm sorry," she breathes, though she knows it's not enough. Not nearly enough. "Tell them," he gasps, "tell them I am not afraid." The defiance in his voice ignites a flicker within her, a small spark amidst the consuming darkness. Time stretches, and she is lost in a whirlwind of memories, their shared childhood, the laughter, the freedom of running barefoot under the sun. A life filled with significance now reduced to this moment of agony. "I remember," she whispers again, "I remember." Eric steps forward, the tension in the air thickening like smoke. "We can't let this happen," he shouts, voice rising above the crowd now growing restless, hungry for blood. "We are not the damned." But they are, all of them, chained by their own desires and fears. Elara reaches for Eric, her fingers trembling as she grasps his arm. "We can't change this," she pleads, desperation clawing at her throat. "We're just bystanders, ghosts haunting the edges of this nightmare." The wheel turns, creaking ominously, as if it knows the truth they refuse to accept. The man beneath it screams again, a sound that shatters the silence, pulling them deeper into the abyss. Each cry is a reminder of their own fragility, the harsh reality that life, their lives, can be extinguished in an instant. And as the wheel begins to turn, slowly, methodically, they stand paralyzed, caught in the web of their own emotions, the world around them fading into a blur, nothing more than a backdrop to the unfolding tragedy. The wheel of fate spins on, and they can only watch as the slow and painful death of the damned draws near. The bell tolls again, each chime a countdown to despair, a reminder that time, relentless and unforgiving, marches onward. Elara's breath comes in ragged gasps, her heart pounding against her chest like a caged bird. She knows she must act, but the weight of her own fears pins her down, keeping her rooted in place. I remember, she whispers again, but this time, she feels the walls of despair closing in, her own memories suffocating her. The wheel turns. In the heart of a moonless night, the air hung heavy with an uneasy stillness, an unbroken silence that wrapped around the village like a shroud. Shadows flickered, dancing specters of dread beneath the dim flicker of torches. The stench of fear permeated the cobblestone streets, a visceral reminder that something terrible was about to unfold. I stood there, breath caught in my throat, a witness to the grotesque spectacle that was about to mar the history of Wallachia. A figure loomed, silhouetted against the faint glow of a dying fire, a man draped in darkness, his face a mask of intensity and rage, yet oddly compelling, as if drawn from a nightmare. Vlad the Impaler. I remember the way my heart pounded, a frantic drum echoing in the cavern of my chest. The villagers, their faces pale as moonlight, hovered at the edges of the square, uncertainty binding them to the ground. I caught sight of Elena, a young woman with eyes like burnt amber, struggling to keep her composure. She was always so brave, so full of life, yet at this moment, the light in her gaze flickered like a candle in a storm. I wanted to reach out, to tell her that this was not the end, but words failed me. Her brother, a boy of no more than 15, stood beside her, quaking with terror. I remember the tales, he whispered, almost to himself. The tales of Vlad. A chill swept through the air. The villagers whispered, their breaths shallow, as Vlad approached a wooden stake, sharp and ominous, waiting to pierce the very fabric of humanity. "Will you watch?" he called out, his voice like gravel scraping against stone, an invitation wrapped in menace. "Will you bear witness to the price of betrayal?" The crowd gasped, a collective intake of horror, as he gestured towards the figure at the foot of the stake, a traitor, a man whose greed had led him to this moment, bound and broken, a mere puppet in the hands of fate. Elena's hand trembled against her brother's shoulder. "What have we become?" she murmured, her voice quaking under the weight of despair. She had grown up in this village, her laughter echoing along the riverside, and now, it felt like the very chains of history were dragging her into the abyss. I could see her heart ache, a beautiful, fragile thing caught in the maw of brutality. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her that courage could rise from the ashes of darkness, but my tongue felt like lead, weighed down by the heavy air. Vlad turned to face the crowd, eyes blazing with a fervor that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. "They say I am a monster," he spat, venom lacing his words. "But monsters are born from the fear of the weak. They are creations of those who cower in the night, who betray their kin." He raised a hand, and the moon slipped behind a cloud, swallowing the world in darkness. "I am not the monster," he continued, voice booming, "but the darkness that lurks in every heart." Each word struck like a hammer against fragile glass, shattering illusions of safety. I felt the energy shift, a pulse reverberating through the crowd, a mixture of dread and a sickening allure. I glanced at the boy, whose eyes were wide, reflecting the flickering flames of the torches. I saw his internal struggle, a collision of youthful innocence and the harsh reality of survival. "Do we turn away?" he whispered to his sister, voice trembling on the precipice of despair. "Or do we become like him?" Elena's gaze hardened, a sudden steel threading through her vulnerability. "To survive is to endure the darkness," she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her fear. "But at what cost?" The traitor, the man whose life hung by a thread, let out a strangled cry as Vlad approached him, the cruel glint in his eyes a promise of suffering. "You sought power, and now you shall feel its weight," he hissed, the words curling around the traitor like a serpent, squeezing the life from him. The stake stood waiting, an instrument of fate, glistening ominously in the flickering light. I could see the hunger in Vlad's gaze, a ravenous lust for retribution that threatened to consume him whole. And then, in a heartbeat, it happened. The stake pierced through flesh, slick and brutal, a grotesque ballet of pain and despair. The traitor's scream sliced through the night, raw and haunting, as if the very sound could peel back the skin of the world, revealing the darkness lurking beneath. I felt the heat of the flames, the acrid scent of burning flesh, mingling with the metallic taste of blood that hung in the air. Elena turned away, her brother clutching her hand, terror etched across their faces. "We have to leave," she whispered urgently. But I stood transfixed, entranced by the macabre spectacle, the way the shadows danced, swirling around Vlad like a cloak. I felt a terror so profound I almost breathed it in, yet there was a part of me that was spellbound by the raw power of it all. This was history unfolding, a moment that would echo through time. "Look," a villager shouted, voice trembling. "Look at what he has become." Vlad stood there, a picture of gruesome triumph, the embodiment of vengeance, and in that moment, I saw him not just as a monster but as a man consumed by his own demons, battling a darkness that whispered sweet promises of power in his ear. The crowd erupted in chaos, some turned away, fleeing the horror, while others remained, captivated by the spectacle. I felt Elena pull at my arm, desperate to escape the grasp of this nightmare, but I was rooted to the spot, caught in the web of history. I remember, I thought, I remember what it means to feel alive in the face of death. Vlad's laughter echoed in the darkness, a chilling sound that sent shivers racing down my spine. "This is the art of torture," he proclaimed, voice dark and intoxicating. "To make every man a reminder of the cost of betrayal." And there, in the heart of that moonless night, as life hung in the balance, I felt the world shift. The stories of old were coming alive, the whispers of history beckoning with an intoxicating allure that promised both understanding and madness. I was lost in the folds of time, teetering on the edge of a precipice, and I could only wonder, would I ever escape this darkness? Or had I already become part of Vlad's twisted legacy, bound by the shadows that dance beyond the light? The darkness was palpable, a heavy blanket that pressed down on my chest, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I lay still, a prisoner in this suffocating void, my thoughts swirling like leaves caught in an autumn wind. I could feel the damp stone beneath me, cold and unyielding. Was it the floor of a dungeon or the grave? The silence was deafening, a void so deep it swallowed screams whole. I could taste the metallic tang of fear in my mouth, thick like blood, as I strained to remember the last moment of light. I remember the flicker of a candle, the faint glow of hope, before it was extinguished. I remember the shadows dancing on the walls, flickering forms that twisted into grotesque shapes, taunting me with their silent laughter. I remember the echo of my heartbeat, each thud a drumroll of impending doom. What had I done to deserve this? My mind raced, searching for a reason, a justification. I was no monster, merely a man caught in the gears of a merciless machine. The pendulum hung above me, a dark harbinger of my fate, its blade glistening like a serpent's tongue. It swayed slowly, tauntingly, a pendulum of time that ticked away my sanity, inching closer with each passing moment. How had I become so ensnared in this web of horrors? I could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. There was a rhythm to it, an agonizing dance between dread and despair. And then there was her. I could almost see her face, the softness of her features, the warmth in her eyes that had once ignited a fire in my heart. Isabella. Would she remember me? Would she ever know the depths of my fear, the torment of my soul? I could hear her laughter echoing in my mind, a bittersweet melody that cut through the darkness, softening the edges of my terror. Yet, now it was just a ghost of a memory, haunting me like the spectre of death that loomed overhead. I remember the day we first met. The sun had kissed the earth, and the world was alive with the vibrant colors of spring. I had been a fool, so consumed by ambition that I failed to notice the shadows creeping in around me. I thought I could escape the tightening noose of fate, but here I was, bound to this cold, heartless stone, a mere pawn in a game I didn't understand. The pendulum swung lower, the blade glinting in the faint light, each swing a promise of pain. I could almost hear the whispers of the crowd, their anticipation palpable, their eyes burning with the thrill of my impending demise. I could not bear it, the knowledge that they would revel in my suffering. I could not give them the satisfaction. I had to fight. I had to resist, even as the panic clawed at my insides, twisting and writhing like a living thing. In the corner of my vision, I saw the pit, a gaping maw of darkness that seemed to beckon me with open arms. Was this my escape? I could hear it calling, the promise of freedom wrapped in the guise of eternal slumber. I felt a pull toward it, a magnetic force that drowned out the rational part of my mind. But then I remembered the flicker of Isabella's smile, the warmth of her touch, the promise of a life untainted by fear. I could not succumb, I would not give in to despair. I needed to fight, to turn the tide of fate. I was more than a victim, I was a man clinging to the remnants of a life that still held beauty, even in the depths of darkness. I could hear the tick-tock of time, the metronome of my fate counting down the seconds. The pendulum swung ever closer, and I felt my heart race in response. With each sway, I could feel the weight of my life bearing down on me, the memories crashing like waves against the rocks of my mind. I could almost taste the salt of my tears, mingling with the taste of blood, as I grappled with the absurdity of it all. Time felt elastic, stretching and warping as I fought to hold on to my sanity. I began to scream, a raw, primal sound that echoed off the walls. I screamed for Isabella, for lost dreams and shattered hopes, for the moment before it all went wrong. But my voice was swallowed by the darkness, fading into the shadows that wrapped around me like a shroud. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pendulum stopped. My heart stuttered in my chest, a moment of silence stretching into eternity. I was left suspended in that single heartbeat, hanging between despair and hope. I had a choice. I could leap into the pit, surrender my soul to the abyss, or I could rise, defy the fate that had been thrust upon me. I felt a surge of defiance, a fire igniting within me as I fought against the bonds that held me captive. I was no longer just a man facing execution, I was a force of nature, a storm brewing beneath the quiet surface. I would not go quietly, I would not be just another name etched into the annals of despair. As I wrestled with my circumstances, I felt a flicker of warmth, a memory of Isabella's laughter, wrapping around me like a cloak. I was not alone. I would fight for her, for us, for the dreams we had woven together in the fabric of a brighter future. The pendulum began to swing again, but this time, I met it with resolve. I would not be a victim, I would not fade into oblivion. I would rise from this darkness, from the pit that threatened to claim me, and I would face whatever lay ahead with an indomitable spirit. In the depths of despair, I found a flicker of hope, a spark that ignited a fire within me. I would not be forgotten. I would not let my story end here, in this wretched place where the shadows danced and death loomed. I was alive, and I intended to stay that way. And as the pendulum swung closer, I braced myself for the confrontation, for the truth that awaited me in the darkness. The echoes of my heartbeat merged with the rhythm of the pendulum, a symphony of fear and defiance, a thrilling crescendo that promised to tear apart the fabric of my existence. The end was not the end, it was merely the beginning. The air was thick with an unspeakable dread. A single flicker of light, barely illuminating the damp stone walls, cast grotesque shadows that twisted and curled like the souls trapped in this forgotten dungeon. I could hear the faint sound of water dripping somewhere, each drop echoing like a heart beating in the silence, a relentless reminder of life amidst death. The scent of rust and decay pierced my senses, and I stood there, paralyzed, as the reality of what lay ahead seeped into my very bones. Emilia trembled in the corner, her back pressed against the cold stone. She was a flicker of light against the darkness, a defiant spark amid the terror. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps, and I could see the way her fingers fidgeted, clasping and unclasping as if trying to hold onto some thread of sanity. I wanted to reach for her, to tell her everything would be okay, but how could I? How could I offer solace when I felt the same gnawing fear? I remember the first time I saw a rat, she whispered, her voice barely audible, trembling like the flame of a dying candle. I was 7. It was in the marketplace, scuttling between the stalls, and I thought it was cute. Little did I know, her voice trailed off, the memory morphing into something dark and twisted. The rats here were not cute, they were harbingers of a nightmare more real than any child's imaginings. And then there was Marcus. He stood a few feet away, a silent sentinel with fists clenched so tight that his knuckles turned white. In the dim light, his face was a mask of rage and despair, features hardened by a burden of guilt that seemed to crush him from the inside out. He had always been the protector, the hero in stories we told ourselves. But here, in this forsaken place, he felt anything but heroic. "I can't let them do this," he breathed, his voice low and fierce, a promise wrapped in desperation. His eyes burned with an intensity fueled by memories of laughter, of love, of a world outside these walls that still had color, still had hope. But hope was fleeting, slipping away like sand through fingers, and the realization twisted in my gut. What power did we have against the inevitability of what was to come? The door creaked open with a groan, the sound slicing through the air like a knife. Shadows poured in, figures cloaked in darkness, faces obscured but their intentions clear. The leader of the group stepped forward, a grim smile curling at the corners of his lips, as if this were all some twisted game. He was a man who thrived on the suffering of others, who relished the power he wielded. His presence alone made the air feel heavier, suffocating. "Ah, look at the brave little rats," he sneered, eyes glinting with malice. "So full of hope. Such delicious irony." With a swift motion, he gestured toward the wooden crate behind him, and my heart lurched as the lid creaked open, revealing a nest of restless, squirming bodies, hungry rats, their eyes glinting with a primal instinct. I could almost hear their breath, quick and raspy, as if they sensed the palpable fear in the room. Time stretched, each second heavy with anticipation. What was worse, the physical brutality that awaited or the psychological torment that had already begun sinking its teeth into our minds? I could feel my heart racing, thudding against my ribs like a trapped animal. The rats were no longer mere creatures, they were symbols of our impending doom, embodiments of the cruelty we were about to face. Emilia's eyes darted to Marcus, searching for reassurance, an anchor in the storm. "What do we do?" she asked, desperation lacing her words. "I won't let them take you," he promised, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. I could see him mentally calculating, weighing options that didn't exist. The truth was, there was no escape. The walls were watching, the shadows closing in, and we were merely pawns in a game that had already been lost. But I remembered. I remembered the laughter we shared, the dreams whispered beneath starlit skies. I remembered the way our lives had once felt vibrant, full of possibility. Would we be reduced to mere memories, a fleeting thought in the minds of our torturers? The rats began to claw against the edges of the crate, a cacophony of scratching and scuffling that sent a shiver racing down my spine. It was the sound of fear made flesh, an echo of our collective dread. And as the leader approached, a sadistic grin plastered across his face, I felt something shift within me. "Let's begin, shall we?" he purred, each word dripping with malicious delight. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just a physical torment. It was a severing of our very humanity. The psychological brutality was relentless. The fear of the unknown gnawed at us, it was a ravenous beast that fed on our despair. "Emilia," I reached for her, my hand brushing against hers, grounding us both in a world that was quickly slipping away. We faced this together. And for a heartbeat, it was enough. The connection pulsed between us, a lifeline amid the rising tide of panic. "Together," she echoed, her voice gaining strength. But Marcus stood frozen, caught between the desire to protect and the reality of our situation. The fear in his eyes battled against the fierce resolve that had always defined him. "I won't let them win," he said, a vow forged in the fires of despair. But the leader's laughter filled the chamber, hollow and cruel, drowning out all hope. The rats clawed their way toward us, a wave of fur and teeth, their tiny bodies a grotesque army marching toward our doom. And in that breathless moment, the world around us blurred, the reality of our impending fate looming larger than life itself. Every heartbeat echoed like a war drum, every breath laced with the bitter tang of fear. We were on the precipice of something unfathomable, and with the shadows closing in, all we could do was cling to the fragile thread of each other's hands and brace for the unimaginable. The darkness was patient, watching, waiting for the moment when hope would fade into despair, when the laughter would turn to screams, when humanity would buckle beneath the weight of cruelty. It was a cycle, an endless loop of torment that had existed long before us and would continue long after we were gone. And so, we stood together, trembling yet unyielding, our hearts entwined against the encroaching darkness, preparing ourselves for the irrevocable clash between human spirit and the horrors that awaited us. In that moment, I understood the depth of our shared humanity, the very thing they sought to extinguish. And as the rats surged forward, I held on to that understanding like a lifeline, knowing that in this grotesque theater of pain, our spirits would refuse to be broken. The air was thick, oppressive, stifling in a way that seeped into the bones. A crowd gathered, their whispers swirling like the autumn mist, shadows dancing across the cobblestones. I stood there, feet rooted in the dirt, heart pounding like a war drum in my chest. I was not merely an observer, no, I was the pulse of the moment. At the center of this macabre theater lay a makeshift contraption, wooden beams haphazardly stitched together, the sun glinting off rusty metal. Pressing. The word echoed in my mind, a violent whisper that made my skin crawl. It conjured images of weight, not just the physical burden of stone and timber, but the weight of justice, justice wrought from the anguished cries of the guilty and the innocent alike. There was Eleonora, trembling, her hands clasped tight enough to turn her knuckles white. She had once been my ally, a woman of strength and resolve, but fear had hollowed her out, and in her eyes, I saw the reflection of our shared dread. "Do you think they'll let him go?" she murmured, barely audible, her voice laced with desperation. "No," I replied, the truth choked in my throat. The crowd was hungry for blood, for retribution, and the law, our twisted, cruel law, would demand a sacrifice. Just the day before, a man had been caught stealing bread. Little did they know, the hunger gnawing at his belly was the same that haunted us all. A crime of survival, yet here we stood, poised to witness a punishment that bore no mercy. The sun dipped lower, its fiery glow casting an eerie light on the man shackled to the device. His name was Thomas, a thin thread of a man caught in a web of desperation. I remembered the way he had smiled, a crooked grin that betrayed his struggles but also his humanity. Now, he was reduced to a mere spectacle, his fate resting on the judgment of a mob that knew nothing of his true plight. "Why do we do this?" I whispered to Eleonora, the question more for myself than for her. "Why do we allow our lives to be governed by such barbarity?" "Because we're afraid," she replied, tears pooling in her eyes like rainwater in a cracked pot. "We're afraid of what happens if we don't. If justice doesn't weigh heavy on those who sin, what's left for us?" The axe of morality hung overhead, and I could almost hear it whispering, taunting me in the soft cadence of the gathering dusk. Nighttime was approaching, but it was not the dark that frightened me, it was the revelation of our own shadows, the specters of our choices that we could not escape. The executioner approached, a hulking figure draped in dark rags, his face obscured by a hood that seemed to be woven from the very fabric of nightmares. He was a ghost, a ghastly reminder of the darkness that lay within us all. I felt the breath of the crowd grow shallow, the tension thickening like the fog rolling in from the hills. "Press him," someone shouted, the chant swelling like a tide. "Press him!" The words reverberated through the air, a primal cry of power and fear. It was a ritual, an ancient dance, and we were all unwitting participants, compelled by an instinct older than time itself. Eleonora trembled beside me, her resolve crumbling as she watched her husband's face contort in agony. "I can't, oh God, I can't bear this." The sobs racked her body, each one a dagger to my heart. I wanted to wrap her in my arms, to shield her from the horror, but how could I when I was just as trapped? Thomas's eyes met mine, and in that fleeting moment, everything else faded away. I remembered the conversations we'd had, the dreams we'd spun under the vast expanse of the night sky, where the stars glittered like promises unbroken. "Help me," he seemed to plead, though no words escaped his lips. I felt the weight of his gaze like a stone on my chest. Would I have the courage to defy the crowd? To push back against the tide of justice that demanded blood? But what did courage mean when faced with such overwhelming fear? The iron pressure of the device began to close in on him, creaking like ancient bones awakening from slumber. A grim spectacle, yet there was beauty in its brutality. The way shadows stretched, the gasps of the crowd like a symphony of despair, all painted upon the canvas of twilight. "Press him!" The chant surged again, a primal roar of the masses, echoing the very fears that tethered us to this moment, this agony. What had Thomas done so wrong? Why was survival an offense worthy of such a terrible fate? I could see Eleonora struggling against the tide of despair, her resolve flickering like a candle in the wind. "I can't let them do this," she whispered fiercely, determination igniting the depths of her soul. My heart raced, tethered to her yearning. But as the weight of justice came crashing down, I realized the truth stitched into the fabric of our existence. We were all complicit, a tapestry woven from the threads of fear and darkness. Each of us bore the burden, and as the moment drew nearer, I felt the slow, deliberate approach of the inevitable. "Eleonora, listen," I started, but the words were swallowed by the cries of the crowd. Pressing. The weight of justice. Time stretched and twisted, each second an eternity wrapped in anguish. The darkness folded around us like a shroud, a reminder that even as we grasped for justice, we were inextricably bound to the very horror we sought to escape. It was then that I understood, this was not merely about Thomas, nor simply about justice. It was about us, all of us, caught in a cycle of our own making. The final moment arrived. The world held its breath. And just as the weight came crashing down, I felt time cease. The air thickened. The crowd gasped in unison, a collective intake of breath that echoed through the very marrow of my bones. In that heartbeat of stillness, I saw Eleanor's face, twisted with grief and rage, and I knew that even if Thomas's body were pressed to the earth, his spirit would rise. We would remember. We had to remember. And as I stood there, encircled by shadows, I felt the weight of it all. The weight of justice, the weight of despair, and the haunting weight of our own humanity. The moon hung low, a silver coin lost in a sea of ink, casting an eerie glow over the cobbled streets of the city. Shadows danced, flickering like whispers, and in a dark alley, a distant scream shattered the silence, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the night. It was the kind of scream that lingers, twisting in the air like smoke, wrapping around your throat until you choke on the horror it implies. I remember when the first body was found, splayed out like a grotesque work of art, skin peeled back to reveal the raw, glistening muscle beneath. It was a warning, a ghastly declaration of power. In that moment, fear gripped the town like a vice, squeezing until it was impossible to breathe, much less think. I was there, crouched in the shadows of a window, heart hammering against my ribs, a wild bird desperate to escape. I was an unwilling witness to a ritual not meant for eyes like mine. Daniel, my brother, my protector, stood at the center of the chaos, a figure of defiance against the madness. His jaw was set, a line of determination etched into his features, but I could see the tremor in his hands. He looked at me then, those dark eyes filled with a storm of emotions, anger, fear, despair. He was wrestling with the reality of what had to be done, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like an iron yoke. "They think it's justice," he muttered, voice low and gravelly, "but it's just a show. They'll flay him alive, and everyone will watch." The word flay hung in the air between us, heavy and grotesque, a grotesque promise of pain. It was a punishment for the worst kind of crime, betrayal, murder, the deepest transgressions against the very fabric of our society. But the truth spilled out in hushed conversations, whispered among those with enough guts to confront the reality. It was less about justice and more about fear. "Fear is a weapon," I whispered back, the truth spilling from my lips like venom. "And they wield it like a sword." Daniel turned from me, eyes scanning the shadows. "We have to stop this," he said, his voice a steel blade cutting through uncertainty. "We can't let them turn cruelty into entertainment." But deep down, I saw the flicker of doubt. The city was a hungry beast, ravenous for blood, and Daniel's resolve was slipping. The night wore on, and the anticipation swelled like a dark tide, heavy and suffocating. The air tasted like ash, and every heartbeat felt like a countdown. The crowd gathered, a mass of faces twisted in anticipation, morbid curiosity lighting their eyes. I could see them, those ghoulish faces, eager for the spectacle, their excitement igniting in the dim light. "Look," someone shouted, pointing toward the dais where the condemned man was tied, bound like a sacrificial lamb. A gasp ran through the throng as the executioner appeared, a silhouette against the pale moon. The blade glistened with a cold hunger, a promise of suffering etched into its surface. And then, it began. The first cut was met with a collective intake of breath, a sharp, collective gasp that echoed through the crowd. I felt my stomach twist, a knot of dread tightening as the man's skin peeled back in a slick, agonizing ribbon. It was a symphony of horror, each note a scream, each measure a wail of despair. I wanted to look away, to shield my eyes from the grotesque ballet unfolding before me, but I was frozen, rooted in place by the sheer weight of the moment. "Can you feel it?" Daniel's voice was a low murmur, almost lost beneath the cacophony. I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. The brutality was palpable, wrapping around us like a suffocating shroud. I could taste the bile rising in my throat, the visceral reaction to the spectacle, a grotesque dance of blood and skin. As the executioner worked, I saw the wild light of madness spark in the crowd, a twisted ecstasy. They were no longer spectators, they were participants in the ritual, feeding on the pain like vampires in the night. I watched faces contort in pleasure and horror, a grotesque tapestry woven from humanity's darkest impulses. "Stop this," I begged Daniel, my voice a whisper against the storm. "We can't let them consume us. We can't be part of their madness." He looked at me, vulnerability flashing in his eyes. "What do we do?" The question hung in the air, heavy with despair. The answer felt impossibly distant, like stars obscured by clouds of smoke. Then I saw something shift in the crowd, a movement that whispered promises of change. A man stepped forward, his face obscured by the shadows but his voice clear, cutting through the din. "This is not justice," he shouted, and for a moment, the crowd hesitated, uncertainty flickering like a candle in the wind. "Join me," he cried, and as he spoke, the air thickened with the promise of rebellion. "We can't let fear dictate our lives." His words hung there, a prayer in the night, a spark in the suffocating darkness. But fear is a powerful thing, a beast that grips the heart and squeezes until you forget who you are. The crowd shifted, whispers buzzing like angry bees, and I felt the tension surge, a wave crashing against the rocks of complacency. Daniel's hand tightened around mine, a lifeline in the storm. "We have to do something," he said, his voice steady, a promise made amid the chaos. "We can't let this continue." As the executioner brought the blade down once more, the crowd erupted, half in horror, half in frenzied excitement. I knew the moment had come, the breaking point where fear could either shatter our resolve or ignite a fire within us. "Now!" I shouted, the word escaping my lips in a rush, the urgency pulsing through my veins. "We can change this. We can turn the tide." But as I looked into Daniel's eyes, I saw the flicker of doubt begin to fade. The moment stretched, an eternity caught in time, a breath held in anticipation. And I knew, deep in my heart, that the battle between fear and defiance had only just begun. The chaos grew, and as the first cries of rebellion began to rise, I felt the world shift beneath our feet. The city, once a stage for cruelty, was becoming something else, a battleground for the soul. The flaying was not just an end, it was a beginning, a grotesque rebirth into the unknown. And as darkness loomed, I held on to hope, gripping it tightly like a lifeline, knowing that every heartbeat was a revolution waiting to ignite. The silence is deafening, a stillness so thick you could slice through it with a rusty blade. Shadows twist and dance across the stone walls of the dimly lit chamber, whispering secrets of a past drenched in blood and despair. It's here, at the brink of an unspeakable horror, that I find myself, heart pounding like a war drum in the stillness. The Iron Maiden looms before me, its gleaming exterior both mesmerizing and terrifying, a grotesque masterpiece of medieval engineering, a coffin with 1,000 teeth. I remember the first time I laid eyes on it. The air was heavy with the stench of damp stone and old fear, my fingers tingling as they traced the cold, metal outline. I was drawn in, seduced by the macabre elegance of the instrument. What a splendid torture device it seemed, a seemingly perfect marriage of art and agony. Yet here I stood, a witness to its darker reality, my mind racing with visions of unspeakable suffering. Caught in the grip of my own emotions, I glanced sideways at Edric, a young scribe with ink-stained fingers and a heart that still beat with the naive hope of youth. His eyes widened in horror, reflecting the flickering torchlight like twin moons caught in a storm. "Is it true?" he gasped, the tremor in his voice betraying a fragile courage. "Did they really use it? Did it really kill?" I could see the churning conflict within him, a desire to witness the truth battling with a primal instinct to flee. "It's a legend," I breathed, though the words felt like a lie. A myth spun from the threads of fear and imagination. But my voice faltered, memories clawing their way to the surface. But what if it's not? Then there was Lyra, a fierce woman with an unyielding spirit and shoulders burdened by the weight of loss. She stood tall, fists clenched at her sides, her jaw set in defiance. "My brother," she murmured, a distant sadness clouding her gaze. "He was accused of witchcraft, thrown into a cell, forgotten. They said he rotted away, but did he suffer like this? She pointed at the Iron Maiden, her voice rising with each word, a tempest of grief and anger. Did he die by the hands of those monstrosities? The air trembled with her rage, and I felt it penetrate my skin, a chill running down my spine. The device, the beautiful horror, was no longer merely a relic, it had become a symbol of despair, a testament to the cruelty of mankind's darkest impulses. Every creak of the iron doors echoed with the screams of the damned, the cries of those who had faced the merciless embrace of this ghastly prison. "Look!" Edric shouted, and I followed his gaze, my heart sinking. The doors of the Iron Maiden were ajar, revealing a cavernous maw lined with sharp spikes. A grotesque invitation to death. "It looks hungry," he whimpered, and I could see the innocence slipping from him, replaced by the cold grip of reality. Doesn't that feel familiar? That moment when you realize life is not a fairy tale, that the monsters lurking in the shadows aren't just figments of nightmares. The Iron Maiden was no fairy tale, it was the raw, unfiltered truth of human cruelty. "I remember," I whispered, my thoughts a swirling tempest, the fear that gripped the hearts of the innocent, the way shadows lengthened like fingers reaching for the throat. The images flooded back, men and women, once vibrant and alive, reduced to nothing but husks of their former selves, victims of a society obsessed with control through pain. Lyra's voice broke through my reverie, a cutting edge of desperation. "Did they have a choice?" she pleaded, directing her question toward the Iron Maiden, as if it could answer. "Was there ever a chance they could escape?" The device stood silent, a mocking testimony to the futility of hope. I stepped closer, drawn in. The hinges squeaked in protest as I traced the outlines of its structure, the polished metal glinting ominously. Each spike seemed to pulse with a life of its own, whispering tales of torment. "They say it was a deterrent," I managed to reply, my throat tight. "A way to keep the people in line." But was it truly effective, or merely a facade for the bloodlust of those in power? Edric's face paled, and Lyra's fury simmered just beneath the surface. "A deterrent," she scoffed, her voice bitter as crushed bones. "Or perhaps a twisted form of entertainment for those who revel in suffering." In that moment, we were bound together, not just by our shared horror of this device, but by an unshakable realization. We stood at the crossroads of humanity's darkest impulses. Each breath felt like a countdown, suspense hanging heavy in the air like the fog that envelops a graveyard at dawn. "Imagine," I murmured, a chill creeping down my spine, the cries echoing off these walls, the desperate pleas for mercy that fell on deaf ears. Time stretched, the weight of history bearing down on us like 1,000 specters. Every heartbeat echoed the stories of those who had faced the Iron Maiden, their voices woven into the very fabric of the room. I looked at Edric, the boy whose innocence was shattering before my eyes, and Lyra, who bore the scars of loss etched deep into her soul. "What do we do with this knowledge?" I asked, each word a tremor of fear and resolve. "How do we reconcile the myth with the reality?" A collective silence enveloped us, a fragile breath caught in the throat of history. The Iron Maiden loomed, a silent witness to our turmoil and a reminder that our reality can be just as monstrous as the legends we construct. Each of us was left to grapple with the weight of truth, the understanding that we too could become the architects of our own nightmares. And in that haunting stillness, as shadows played tricks on the eyes, we stood united, vulnerable yet resilient, haunted yet determined. The Iron Maiden called to us, not just as a device of torment, but as a chilling reminder of humanity's capacity for darkness. And as we faced the abyss, we couldn't help but wonder, what happens when the line between myth and reality blurs, when the echoes of the past bleed into the present? With hearts racing and souls bared, we lingered in that chamber, teetering on the edge of understanding, knowing full well that the tale of the Iron Maiden, much like our own, was far from over. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a sickly yellow glow over the small clearing. Shadows danced nervously among the trees, whispering secrets only the wind could understand. I stood there, heart racing, as the air thickened with a tension that wrapped around my throat like a noose. The cries of the condemned echoed in my ears, a cacophony of despair that felt almost tangible, almost alive. In the pit of my stomach, I felt the churn of dread, the gnawing worry that this scene would unfold in ways I couldn't yet fathom. "Please, don't!" The voice of a man, hoarse and trembling, shattered the oppressive silence. His name was Arosh. I had known him for years, his laughter once bright and infectious. Now, it was a shadow of its former self, replaced by an overwhelming fear that consumed him. He stood bound, exposed to the elements, to the horror of his fate, a fate that I could hardly believe existed, cloaked in ancient cruelty. "Just let me go." His eyes, filled with the wild panic of a man who had seen the edge of his own mortality, locked onto mine, begging for understanding, for help. I wanted to scream, to rush to him, to tear away the chains of despair. But rooted to the spot, I felt the weight of my own guilt pressing down, a heavy mantle woven from threads of memories that twisted like vines in my mind. Beside me was Ilara, her face pale as the moon, eyes shimmering with a mix of horror and determination. She had once been the light of the village, a healer with a gentle hand and a soothing touch. Now, her hands trembled at her sides, clenched into fists that bore the marks of desperation. "We can't let this happen," she whispered, voice barely above a breath, but the conviction behind her words was palpable. I could see it in her eyes, the flicker of a flame that refused to be extinguished, even in the face of unimaginable terror. My mind raced back to the stories we had whispered in the dark, tales of a method so grotesque it felt like a nightmare snatched from the pages of a madman's diary. Scaphism, they called it. Death by insects, a slow and torturous demise that made the very thought of it crawl under your skin. I remembered my laughter then, the absurdity of it. Who would ever do this? I had scoffed. Now, the reality stood before me like a grim spectre, and I could taste the bile rising in my throat. Arosh's body shook, each tremor echoing the heartbeat of the earth beneath us. Please, please, it was a mantra, a desperate prayer to the gods who had long since turned their backs. He looked past me, searching for salvation, and I felt the weight of the world pressing on my chest. The fanged embrace of dread wrapped tighter around my heart, each pulse a reminder of the fragile line between life and death. "Ilara, we have to do something," I finally found my voice, though it trembled like a leaf caught in a storm. "We can't just leave him." The words hung in the air, a fragile thread that tethered us to the hope of action. But what could we do against such ancient brutality? The method was already unfolding before our eyes, an unholy ritual that seemed to resonate with the very fabric of time. As if summoned by our fear, the insects began their dark dance. Flies emerged from the shadows, their wings beating like a war drum, a chorus of death descending upon Arosh. My stomach churned as they landed, crawling over him with the casual cruelty of nature. I could see the moment his eyes widened, the flicker of realization, a visceral understanding that he was trapped, no escape from the maw of despair that awaited him. "Arosh!" Ilara screamed, her voice cracking like thunder against the serene backdrop of the trees. It was as if the forest held its breath, the very air vibrating with our horror. I wanted to pull her back, to shield her from the truth, but the gravity of the moment held us in place, our souls interwoven with his suffering. "Hold on," I cried, though the words felt hollow, a pitiful attempt to bridge the chasm of inevitability. My heart raced, each beat a reminder of my own helplessness. I could feel the darkness closing in, seeping through the cracks of my resolve. In that moment, I understood the cruelty of fate, the absurdity of existence, how life could be snuffed out like a candle in the wind, leaving only shadows of what once was. The insects were relentless, a tide of squirming bodies that burrowed and feasted. They were drawn not just to flesh, but to the very essence of fear that radiated from Arosh, a palpable energy that surrounded him like a storm. I wanted to scream, to tear through the night, demanding justice for this grotesque spectacle. But rage morphed into paralysis as I watched the horror unfold, an unwilling spectator in a theater of despair. Ilara clutched my arm, nails digging into my skin as if anchoring herself to reality. Her breath hitched, each gasping inhalation a plea against the inevitable. "We have to stop it," she urged, her voice hoarse with emotion, but there was no plan, no weapon against this ancient cruelty. Each second that passed felt like an eternity, a spiral into madness that left us gasping, clawing at the edges of our own sanity. And then, in that moment suspended between terror and resignation, I felt a flicker of something deeper, a shuddering sense of solidarity. We were three souls intertwined in this macabre dance, each one bearing the scars of helplessness. In a world that had stripped away our innocence, we were left with the raw, gut-wrenching realization that life could be as cruel as it was beautiful. "Look at me!" Arash shouted suddenly, his voice rising above the din of despair. It was a moment of clarity that pierced through the horror, forcing Ilara and me to meet his gaze. "Remember me like this, full of life, not like this." His words reverberated in the dark, a haunting echo that intertwined with the very fabric of our being. I stared, breathless, feeling the weight of his plea deep within my chest. This was more than a moment of suffering, it was a testament to endurance, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable horror, there was a glimmer of humanity that flickered defiantly against the encroaching shadow. And in that instant, as time lost its meaning and the world blurred around us, I knew that this was not just his fight, it was ours, too. How absurd that we had once believed ourselves untouched by this sort of darkness, that we could escape the fangs of fate. Now, as the insects continued their grim ballet, I realized that we were all bound by the same thread, a tapestry woven with sorrow, longing, and a desperate need for connection in a world that often felt designed to tear us apart. But the clock was ticking, and with each passing second, the darkness grew thicker, more suffocating. Arash's voice faded into the distance, his pleas lost in the shuffle of time. Ilara's grip on my arm tightened, and I felt the weight of her resolve. We had to remember. We had to bear witness to the horror, to the absurdity, to the fragility of life itself. As the dance of death continued, I held my breath, caught in a moment that felt both infinitely expansive and painfully fleeting. And as the shadows lengthened, merging with the cries in the darkness, I could only wonder, what do we do when the insects come for us all? The roar of the crowd was deafening, a cacophony of fevered anticipation that reverberated through the dusty air. Elephants stood, massive and imposing, their skin glistening under the harsh sun. Each heartbeat echoed like distant drums calling forth a storm, and the ground trembled with the weight of impending doom. In this moment, it was not just an execution, it was a spectacle, a grotesque theatre of brutality that would etch itself into the souls of all present. I remember the air thick with dust and sweat, the scent of fear mingling with the spice of the marketplace. I stood there, Sita, a lowly seller of spices, rooted in the crowd, heart racing, mind reeling. My palms were clammy, fingers twitching, aching for something to hold onto. My eyes were drawn to Arjun, the condemned man, with his wild hair and desperate eyes, an innocent painted as a villain in the eyes of the law. I had known him once, a gentle soul who laughed at the stars and whispered secrets to the moon. Now, those same eyes were wide with terror, searching the crowd for a glimmer of hope, a last-minute reprieve that would never come. The elephant, a colossal beast named Rani, swayed slightly as if sensing the tension crackling in the air. Her ears flapped, a chilling reminder of the power she held, and I could see the mahout, perched on her back, a cruel smile dancing on his lips. He stroked her neck, whispering sweet nothings as if she were a beloved pet, while I felt the bile rise in my throat. This was not an act of love, it was the apex of cruelty, a dance of death under the glaring sun. I remember the moments that led us here, the whispers in the dark, the fear that gnawed at my gut like a wild animal. Arjun had been accused of treason, a crime that sent shivers down my spine. He had tried to stand against the corrupt, to protect the people who had suffered so long, but the gods of fate had conspired against him. I had watched as his spirit was slowly crushed under the weight of lies and betrayal, the very fabric of our lives unraveling around us. Now, he was about to be crushed under Rani's massive feet, a symbol of the very oppression he had fought against. The sun beat down mercilessly, each ray a sharp reminder of the brutality that unfolded before us. I felt the warmth of tears slip down my cheeks, mingling with the dust, and I wiped them away angrily. But the tears refused to stop, pooling in my heart, a heavy weight that threatened to drown me. I remember the laughter we shared, the nights spent under the stars, dreams whispered into the void. Now, those dreams lay shattered like glass, sharp and cutting. As the moment drew near, I heard the drumbeats quicken, a rhythmic pounding that mimicked the frantic thumping of my heart. The crowd surged forward, a living, breathing entity hungry for the macabre spectacle. I felt myself being pulled along, limbs moving without my consent, a part of this grotesque carnival of death. The executioner raised his hand, the signal to silence. A hush fell over the crowd, a tension so thick it could be sliced with a knife. Arjun stood tall, though his knees shook beneath him. I wondered if he saw me in the crowd, if he could feel my heart reaching out to him, desperate to offer comfort. But those moments were gone, replaced by the harsh reality of what lay ahead. I could almost hear his thoughts, a chorus of anguish and defiance. "If I must die, I will not go quietly," I imagined him saying, a fire igniting in his eyes. The Mahout shouted, and Rani moved forward, her steps slow but deliberate, her massive shadow swallowing my light. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that echoed like a warning cry. I closed my eyes, the world narrowing to the sound of my own heartbeat, a drumroll of despair. I remembered the tales told by the elders, how the mighty elephant, revered and feared, became an instrument of justice, or perhaps, a tool of vengeance. Justice, what a cruel joke it was. As Rani approached, the ground quaked beneath her, and I could see the sun glinting off her tusks, sharp and menacing. It was an image that would haunt me forever, symbol of both power and tragedy. I took a shaky breath, feeling the weight of 1,000,000 souls pressing down on my chest. The fear in the crowd was palpable, wrapping around us like a fog, thick and suffocating. No one dared to look away, we were entranced, trapped in this dreadful ballet of life and death. Rani came to a stop, towering over Arjun, who stood defiant, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "You can crush my body, but my spirit will never be your slave," he shouted, his words lost in the tumult. I felt a surge of admiration mingled with despair. His bravery ignited something deep within me, a flicker of hope against the darkness. And then, in an instant that stretched into eternity, Rani lunged forward. The crowd gasped collectively, a single breath held, a moment suspended in time. I could see Arjun's eyes widen, fear and courage intertwined, and I knew I would never forget this moment, the brutal beauty of it, the rawness that bled into my soul. As the world spun faster, intertwining agony and awe, I felt the crushing weight of history bearing down on us all. The elephant, once a creature of grace and power, became the harbinger of our deepest fears. Shadows danced along the edges of my vision, the ghosts of those who had come before us, their cries mingling with the present. And then silence. Complete, haunting silence. A finality that echoed long after the last breath had been drawn. In that fleeting moment, I understood, this was not just an execution, it was a reminder of our fragility, a testament to the raw, unyielding spirit of rebellion that flickered in the darkest of nights. I remember standing there, heart pounding, breathless. The line between the exotic and the brutal blurred into something unrecognizable, something hauntingly beautiful. And in that moment, I knew the real horror was not the act itself, but what it revealed about us, our capacity for both cruelty and compassion, the eternal struggle against the dark. I was lost, forever trapped in this moment, forever haunted by the weight of it all, the weight of memory, of love, of loss. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting shadows long and deep, I knew this was only the beginning. The echoes of that day would ripple out, intertwining with the stories yet to come, the dance of life and death continuing its relentless waltz. The square was a cruel stage, where the sun seared down mercilessly, casting long, haunting shadows. The air thickened with the scent of sweat and fear, mingling with the acrid odor of smoke rising from torches. A crowd swelled, faces contorted in a mix of morbid curiosity and grim satisfaction. Their breaths were shallow, heartbeats thrumming as they awaited the spectacle. This was no ordinary day, this was an execution, an event both gruesome and mesmerizing, a brutal performance that offered a twisted sense of justice. I remember the moment they brought him out, his hands bound, shoulders slumped under the weight of despair. He was a man like any other, a heartbeat away from life, yet now he was merely a pawn in a game too old to understand. I could see his eyes, wild and pleading, darting among the sea of faces. Could he sense it, the primal energy of the crowd, the dangerous thrill? My heart raced, caught in the tide of emotion swirling around me. I was one of them, my pulse dancing to the rhythm of anticipation. Beside me stood Alice, her fingers trembling against her thigh. She was a woman of fierce convictions, yet here she was, wrestling with her own demons. "It's wrong," she whispered, though the words trembled on her lips like fragile leaves in the wind. Yet I can't look away. I could see the conflict etched across her brow, the clash between moral outrage and the allure of the spectacle. Her breath hitched as she met my gaze, silently begging me to understand. Then there was Thomas, a man with a bitter laugh hiding beneath a layer of cynicism. He leaned forward, eyes gleaming with a mix of excitement and dread. "It's just a show, isn't it?" he said, the words dripping with sarcasm. But I knew better. Behind the bravado, his heart was heavy with a truth he dared not voice. He had seen too much, witnessed too many lives extinguished in the name of order, yet here he was, caught in the thrall of the crowd. His laughter rang hollow, echoing through the chaos. They were all here, drawn by the same magnetic force, the promise of morality restored through bloodshed. As the executioner strode forward, a silhouette against the sun, the crowd's energy shifted. Gasps fluttered like caged birds as they readied themselves for the climax. The man's breaths came out in ragged bursts, each one a desperate plea for mercy. I could taste the salt of his sweat in the air, a bitter reminder of mortality. His fear was palpable, wrapping around us like a cold, clammy shroud. I felt Alice's fingers dig into my arm, I could sense her heart pounding beside me, our souls tethered by this shared horror. I remember the moment the axe fell. It sliced through the air, a sound so sharp it felt like the crack of fate itself. The crowd exhaled, a collective gasp that echoed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the marrow of my bones. I glanced at Alice, her face ashen, and at Thomas, whose eyes glistened with unshed tears. They were both witnesses to a spectacle that was meant to instill fear, yet it stirred something deeper, something disturbing. The body fell, a dark thud that silenced the moment. The crowd held its breath, caught between the thrill of the act and the weight of its implications. I could feel the energy shift, a palpable wave of unease washing over us. Here lay the result of a society hell-bent on control, where death was the ultimate deterrent, and we were the audience, complicit in this grim performance. What do we gain from this? Alice's voice broke through the silence, trembling like a fragile thread. I could see the tears brimming in her eyes, a storm of emotions threatening to spill over. Is this justice? Or just entertainment for the masses? Thomas shrugged, his bravado faltering. Maybe it's both. A reminder of our fragility, wrapped in a package of blood and gore. The words hung heavy in the air, a bitter truth we all cringed to admit. We were enraptured, yet repulsed, caught in the paradox of human nature, a hunger for spectacle mingled with a desperate need for order. The sun dipped low, shadows stretching like fingers across the square, as if reaching for the very souls of the witnesses. I squeezed Alice's hand, feeling her pulse quicken and falter, a reflection of my own turmoil. What if we're next? I whispered, the thought sending chills racing down my spine. The world was a cruel place, justice was a fickle mistress, and tonight, we had all danced on the edge of her blade. With each passing moment, the tension thickened, the crowd, a living entity, surged and swayed, caught in a tempest of emotions. There were children at the edges, their eyes wide and innocent, yet they too were part of this twisted tale. I watched as one small boy clutched his mother's skirt, unaware of the darkness that lingered just beyond his innocent gaze. Would he grow to accept this as normal? Would this cycle of violence become his world? The night deepened, cloaking the square in darkness, yet the remnants of the execution lingered in the air, suffocating and oppressive. I felt the weight of generations pressing down, an echo of the past mingling with the present. We were all witnesses, all complicit in this game of life and death. The clock tower chimed, each stroke a reminder of the relentless march of time, of the ghosts that lingered between the lines of morality. As the crowd began to disperse, I turned to Alice and Thomas, searching for the words that would bridge the chasm of our shared experience. We need to remember, I said, though the conviction in my voice faltered. This can't be how it ends. But even as I spoke, I felt the cold grip of the night tighten around us, stifling hope. The darkness whispered secrets meant to remain unspoken, the price of order exacted in blood. I could feel the weight of history pressing into my chest, a relentless reminder of our own fragility. The square was now emptying, but within each retreating figure, seeds of unease were sown. The ghosts of those lost would haunt this place long after the echoes of the execution faded. And as I stood there, the chill of the night clinging to my skin, I realized we carried a truth that could never be buried. This was not merely a spectacle. This was a reflection of our own souls, a haunting reminder of what it meant to be human in a world that thrived on bloodshed. The echoes of the past reverberated, coiling around my thoughts, and I knew this story was far from over. Tomorrow, the sun would rise again, and the cycle would begin anew, a dance of life and death where the line between justice and entertainment blurred into an indistinguishable haze. All that remained was to confront the shadows lurking within us, to wrestle with the darkness we all carried. The air crackles with tension, a heavy silence enveloping the courtyard, broken only by the distant clanging of the bell tolling in the tower, a harbinger of dread, a countdown to the inevitable. The sun, a ruthless overseer, casts long shadows on the cobblestones, hinting at the darkness that festers in the hearts of men. I stand at the edge, a mere witness to the spectacle unfolding, my heart racing, my breath shallow. Today, it is not the wicked who tremble but the women, those marked by fate, tangled in the strands of justice's cruel tapestry. Cecily, a woman with wild, flame-red hair that dances like a living thing, stands at the center. Her hands are bound, but her spirit, oh, how it roars. She is a spirited rebel, accused of witchcraft, a label slapped on her like a tar-soaked rag. I feel her gaze pierce through the air, defiant, as she stands on the brink of madness and valor. I remember her laughter, a wild symphony echoing in my heart, a sound that now seems like a distant dream, buried under the weight of stone and iron shackles. And then there is Isolde, her eyes pools of shadowed sorrow, watching from the sidelines, torn between loyalty and fear. She had once shared secrets and whispered dreams with Cecily under the stars, their laughter mingling with the night air, but now, the stench of betrayal clings to her like smoke. I sense her conflicting emotions, a swell of love and a chasm of dread. What would she sacrifice to save her friend? What would she lose if she chooses to remain silent? The clock on the tower ticks, relentless, each chime echoing the pulse of their intertwined fates. The crowd surges, a tide of grim faces, eager for the spectacle of blood, the primal hunger for justice twisted by the darkest of desires. I feel their anticipation like a weight pressing down on my chest. They yearn for punishment, for a thrill to break the monotony of their grim lives. They forget that justice is not a theater, it is a brutal, unyielding force that reshapes destinies with stark indifference. The executioner stands, a hulking figure draped in shadow, his presence as chilling as the steel glinting in his hands. He is a man of the law, a man shaped by the same society that clamors for blood, yet I can see the tremor in his hands, the whisper of doubt lurking behind his mask of authority. I wonder if he feels it, if the weight of his actions ever haunts him in the stillness of the night, long after the crowds have dispersed. Cecily stands tall, refusing to bow before the storm. Her voice rises above the murmurs, a fierce anthem calling for justice in a realm where justice has long been a ghost. You call me a witch, but it is your ignorance that spells doom, she screams, her voice raw, electric. My heart races as I witness the raw pain etched into her features, the longing for recognition, for humanity in a world that has cast her aside. Silence her, a voice bellows from the crowd, the mob mentality igniting like wildfire. I cringe at the hatred, how quickly they turn, how easily they forget that she, too, is flesh and blood, a heart beating with dreams just like theirs. Isolde crumbles beneath the weight of it all, her hands trembling, hovering between the urge to scream out for her friend and the suffocating reality of the world they inhabit, a world where a woman's voice is often silenced, a world where the stakes are higher than friendship. I remember nights spent under the open sky, where dreams felt tangible, where laughter rang free. But here, in this moment, dreams are nothing more than echoes, caught in the web of fear and misunderstanding. As Cecily is dragged closer to the executioner, my stomach churns, the dread wrapping around me like a shroud. And yet, there is a flicker of rebellion in the air. I see it in Isolde's eyes, the moment she realizes she cannot stand by any longer. The betrayal of silence weighs heavy on her shoulders, and with a sudden rush of courage, she steps forward, breaking free from the shadows that have long held her captive. You will not take her, she cries, her voice trembling but resolute, each word a blade cutting through the darkness. The crowd gasps, a collective intake of breath, uncertainty rippling through them. In that instant, everything shifts. I see the flicker of hope in Cecily's eyes, the spark that ignites the remnants of their shared dreams. They had once danced in the moonlight, but now they dance on the edge of a knife. Isolde's betrayal and loyalty entwine, a dance as old as time, one that keeps the hearts of women tethered in a world that seeks to tear them apart. But fear is a powerful weapon, and the crowd turns restless, bloodthirsty. I feel the air crackle with anticipation, the pulse of history thundering beneath our feet. Women have fought for survival in a world that deems them weak, and yet here they stand, two souls grappling with the darkness, the weight of 1,000 histories laid bare before us. The executioner draws closer, a dark omen looming large. I feel their despair, feel the tremor of hope against the cold steel of fate. The stakes rise, the moment stretches, and suddenly, time collapses in on itself. The world outside dissolves, leaving only Cecily's flickering spirit, Isolde's trembling heart, and the dark shadow of the executioner. I can't breathe, my heart thrums in sync with theirs, a wild, frantic rhythm that echoes the very essence of humanity. The tension thickens, gripping my throat like a vice. I remember the stories of women who stood against the tide, their voices woven into the fabric of time. They lived, they fought, they bled, and sometimes, they even won, but at what cost? The question lingers, heavy as the air around me, as the moment teeters on a precipice that promises nothing but abyss. With one final breath, I brace myself for the plunge into despair or salvation, as the boundaries of love and loyalty blur into a haunting dance beneath the sun's unforgiving gaze. And I linger there, caught in the web of their stories, suspended between the echoes of their cries and the silence that follows. A moment that defines them, that binds them, and yet, it is a moment that is far from over, pulsating with the promise of what might yet unfold. The clock ticks, the bell tolls, and the story spirals ever onward, into the shadows waiting to be illuminated. The air was thick with tension, the kind that prickles the skin and leaves you breathless. A crowd gathered, hunched and whispering, their shadows stretching like claws against the cobblestones. In the center stood Eleonora, trembling yet resolute, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm that echoed through her very bones. She could hardly breathe, as if the weight of history pressed down on her. Today, justice would be served, or so they claimed. Today, the noose would tighten around the neck of an innocent man. I remember that moment like it was yesterday, the stench of sweat, the whispers of fear. I remember the way the executioner's axe glinted in the dim light, a promise of finality. There was something grotesquely theatrical about it, as though time had conspired to trap us in a macabre play. The executioner, clad in dark rags, moved with a chilling grace that belied the brutality of his work. A shudder ran through the crowd, the kind that makes your spine tingle. And in that crowd was Marcus, a man torn between duty and morality. He had known the condemned, shared laughter over meager meals, and whispered dreams of freedom. But duty called, didn't it? Justice, they said, required sacrifice. As he watched Eleonora's wide, pleading eyes search the thrumming mass for solace, Marcus felt his heart splinter within him. Was this the justice his father had fought for, a legacy of brutality that twisted the soul into knots? Eleonora screamed, a raw sound that sliced through the air with the desperation of a drowning woman clawing for breath. She lunged towards the platform, desperate to reach him, to grasp his hand one last time. You can't. He's innocent. Hope ignited in her voice, a flickering candle against the encroaching darkness. But the guards, with their stony faces, slammed her back, shoving her into a sea of bodies that churned like the restless ocean. I remember the first time I heard about the rack, I think, a dissonant thought piercing through the chaos of the moment. A charming little device designed for a delightful stretch of both limbs and the truth. It was absurd, really, how torture had been sanitized over centuries, how the laughter of history echoed across the ages. But no amount of laughter could shield Eleonora from the reality before her. With each swing of the executioner's axe, she felt the weight of each decision, each life lost to the insatiable hunger for justice that twisted human hearts. Flashes of memory flooded her mind, a boy's laughter, the warmth of summer days, the way he held her like she was the only thing that mattered. And now, here they were, standing on the precipice of annihilation, time slipping through their fingers like grains of sand. And then there was Marcus, watching the scene unfold, feeling the chains of his own heart tightening around his chest. The crowd's chants reverberated in his mind, justice. Justice! But what was justice when it tore families apart, when it turned friend against friend? He could see the innocence in the condemned man's eyes, the disbelief that a mere accusation could lead to a death sentence. A chill crept down his spine, memories of the medieval gallows flickering in his mind, a haunting echo of a time when justice was as brutal as it was absolute. I remember the tales of the Iron Maiden, that ghastly contraption of metal and malice, designed to puncture and pierce the spirit of its victim while they slowly bled out their last breaths. What a charming way to spend an afternoon, I muse, my own dark humor a shield against the horror unfolding. But this wasn't a tale, not a story to be told over drinks. This was flesh and blood, a life on the line, and the shadows of the past looming large over the present. Eleonora fought against the guards, her voice a desperate melody. "You don't understand. He's not a monster." The strength in her words echoed through Marcus, rippling like a stone thrown into still water. He felt his own resolve crumbling, his heart torn between a duty that felt increasingly hollow and a burgeoning desire to tear down the very notion of justice that had been fed to him since birth. I remember, the words lingered, hanging in the air like a fragile promise. The memories broke over him like waves, his father's stern lectures on honor, justice, the bloodiest tales of medieval retribution echoing in the corridors of his childhood. Justice was a blade, his father would say, sharp and unyielding. But Marcus had learned that every blade had two edges, and today, he felt the cold steel pressing against his own throat. The executioner raised the axe, the motion a slow and deliberate dance, each heartbeat resounding like a drum in his chest. Time stretched, the world narrowing to that moment, the infinite choices leading to this singular, irreversible act. Eleonora's scream pierced through the air, reverberating within him, shaking him from his stupor. It was the sound of a heart breaking, of love eclipsed by the cruelty of a system that knew no mercy. "Justice," he whispered, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. He could no longer differentiate between justice and vengeance, between law and cruelty. The shadows grew long, swallowing the last vestiges of hope as he stepped forward, breaking through the ranks of the crowd with a courage he didn't know he possessed. He was no longer just a witness, he was a participant in this dark theater where lives hung in the balance, where the legacy of brutality would not go unchallenged. And in that moment of confrontation, as the axe descended, the world held its breath. Time hung suspended, a heavy shroud draped over the crowd, a collective gasp echoing through the ages. Eleonora's eyes met Marcus's, a fleeting connection, electric and terrifying. In that gaze, a silent question lingered: "What will you do?" A choice loomed larger than life itself, a crossroads forged in blood and despair. And the shadows, they whispered, beckoning him to step into the light or remain ensnared in the darkness of history's relentless grip. It was a legacy he could not ignore, a brutal reminder that justice, however it was defined, bore the scars of human hearts forever marked by the choices we make in the face of unthinkable brutality.